In a world obsessed with proving strength through money, titles, and appearances, what if the strongest people are the ones who quietly refuse to be broken, even when life throws them into the fire? Modern society tells us to chase comfort, but comfort breeds weakness. Could it be that the discomfort we avoid is actually the path to the resilience we desperately need? We celebrate success, but behind every person of real depth lies struggle, loss, and pain. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Maybe the things you're running from are the very things that could make you unshakable. Welcome to StoicCraft, a place where ancient Stoic wisdom meets modern struggles. Here we don't just talk about philosophy. We craft it into daily life, helping you build strength, clarity, and resilience in a world that constantly tests you. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to live a life untouched by the chaos of the outside world. A life where the noise of society, the unpredictable turns of fortune, and the hardships that inevitably come your way no longer dictate your peace of mind. At first, that sounds like wishful thinking, almost impossible. Yet what if I told you that the path to such strength, to such calm, has existed for thousands of years, waiting patiently for you to notice it? That path is called Stoicism. Every day we are swept up in a storm of emotions, distractions, and desires. Our modern lives are a constant race, always rushing, always noisy, rarely still. But Stoicism stands in contrast, like a steady rock. In the middle of turbulent waters, it teaches us the art of self-control, the resilience to let go, and the toughness to endure without being consumed. The first lesson is simple yet profound. Learn to release what you cannot control. Here's the truth: life itself does not become easier. The challenges don't fade away. What changes is you. Stoicism does not offer an escape from hardship. Instead, it trains you to meet life's struggles with composure, to hold steady when everything around you shakes. It doesn't numb you to life. It sharpens your awareness so that you begin to see what really matters. And in an age obsessed with reaction, ego, and endless noise, Stoicism becomes your anchor, an unshakable foundation. It's important to be clear. Stoicism is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about becoming unbreakable. If you have ever felt overwhelmed, reactive, or exhausted from endlessly chasing things that never deliver lasting fulfillment, you're not alone. This is the human condition in the modern age. But you've arrived in the right place. In this journey, we won't just talk about abstract ideas. We'll uncover practical, powerful lessons from Stoic wisdom, lessons that can reshape how you think, how you respond, and how you live. And if what you hear resonates with you, if it helps you pause, reflect, and navigate life with clearer purpose, consider subscribing. That small action is more than support. It's a statement that you're committed to growth and to walking this path with intention. Because the real battle, as you'll soon discover, is not outside in the world, but inside within your own mind. It's easy to point fingers outward, to blame society, politics, or the people around us. But that's often a convenient distraction. The chaos we see externally usually mirrors the unresolved turmoil within us. Think about it. Our sleepless nights, our restless scrolling, our mood swings, these are not just random occurrences. They're signals of something deeper, something unsettled. Most people never pause long enough to look inward. We keep moving, hoping the momentum will drown out the noise. But it doesn't, it only buries it. Carl Jung once said, "Your visions would become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakes?" Those words are not just poetic, they're deeply practical. The struggles we face every day, procrastination, envy, anger, insecurity, do not appear out of thin air. They rise from patterns formed within us, shaped by experiences, trauma, and long-held beliefs. And unless we bring them into the light, they quietly control us, not through brute force, but through habit, through familiarity. They dictate our choices, restrain our risks, and keep us living the same year, repeatedly mistaking it for life. Most people resist hearing this. It's far easier to believe that peace will arrive once we fix someone else, or once life hands us the promotion, the perfect partner, or silence from our critics. But peace is not passive. It doesn't knock on your door like a package delivery. Peace is built patiently, piece by piece, through truth and honesty with yourself. And that construction always begins in the places we'd rather avoid, our inner conflicts. Think about your own contradictions. You say you want confidence, yet you shrink the moment you are seen. You crave genuine connection, but instinctively push people away when they get close. You long for purpose, yet spend hours hiding from your own thoughts. Why is that? Because the mind is not a single, unified force. It's a battlefield. Plato compared the soul to a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble, one wild. One pulls toward reason, discipline, and virtue. The other toward impulse, chaos, and instant gratification. And you, the charioteer, must steer them both. The truth is, most of us are not even holding the reins. The noble horse whispers of growth and integrity, while the wild horse demands comfort, distraction, and relief right now. And both, whether you like it or not, are parts of you. The goal is not to destroy one side, but to learn how to guide both. That is the deep work, the inner work. It's not about fixing yourself as though you were a broken machine. It's about understanding yourself as a layered story. And every story requires truth, often hard truth. The truth that much of what we chase in life is not really ours. We inherit dreams, absorb expectations, and are conditioned to play roles. The good student, the loyal worker, the reliable friend. Somewhere along the way, the real self, the raw, curious, hopeful self gets buried. Aristotle said that knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom. But in a world where our attention is pulled outward every second, where silence feels unbearable, and restlessness is considered normal, true self-knowledge becomes rare. And when reflection is rare, the cost is high. We become strangers to ourselves. We recognize our polished selfies, but not the shadows behind them. And those shadows matter. They are not evil, they are wounded. Jung called this the shadow, the hidden parts of us we deny, suppress, or fear. The anger we bury, the jealousy we hide, the sadness we silence, it all collects there. And until we face it, until we shine a light into that darkness, it rules us quietly from the shadows. Often it's not in obvious ways, but in the subtle cracks of our reactions, our sudden triggers, and the quiet stories we invent about others. And if we're honest, those stories usually reflect our own fears, not their flaws. To truly understand this inner conflict is to realize something most people avoid. Self-awareness is not a luxury reserved for philosophers. It's a responsibility, because when you don't understand your own mind, you become enslaved by it. Your mind can trick you into believing things that aren't true, replay old wounds as if they were happening all over again, and project your unresolved pain onto others under the name of justice. And perhaps most dangerously, it can keep you endlessly busy filling your days with tasks that feel urgent but leave you empty. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." At first glance, those are harsh words, but he wasn't demanding that we all become scholars. He was pointing to a simple truth. A life without reflection becomes nothing more than repetition, and repetition without understanding leads straight to regret. You wake up years later wondering why you're always tired, why nothing seems to satisfy, and how you manage to drift into a life you never consciously chose. That's the real cost of ignoring the war within. It doesn't just shape your mood, it shapes the entire trajectory of your existence. When we refuse to face our fears, we build our lives around them. We say no to opportunities not because they're wrong, but because they expose us. We stay in familiar pain because the comfort of what we know feels safer than the freedom of the unknown. And to justify it, we label ourselves as practical or realistic, when in truth we're simply scared. And you know what? That's okay. Fear is part of being human, but so is courage. And courage rarely announces itself with loud speeches or heroic gestures. More often, it's quiet. It's found in the small but radical decision to stop running, to sit with your own thoughts without a screen to distract you. It's asking yourself, why do I really feel this way? Instead of reaching for the nearest escape. It's choosing presence over distraction, honesty over false comfort, and growth over the fragile armor of ego. We live in a culture drowning in self-help content, yet starving for genuine self-understanding. There's a vast difference between consuming wisdom and living it, between quoting inspiration and practicing discipline, because insight without integration is just noise. You can read every book, follow every guru, fill your feed with motivational quotes, and still wake up at war with yourself. Information alone doesn't change you. What changes you is attention, focused, patient, uncomfortable attention to your inner life. And when you give yourself that attention, patterns begin to emerge. You notice how quickly your tone shifts when you feel threatened. You notice how you brush off compliments as if you don't deserve them. You catch yourself replaying a mistake from years ago as though it happened yesterday. That's when something profound happens. Compassion, not the sugar-coated, be kind to yourself kind of compassion, but grounded, honest compassion. The kind that recognizes every action you've taken, whether wise or foolish, was rooted in something real: fear, love, confusion, or simply the best attempt you could manage with the tools you had at the time. From that recognition, the war inside begins to soften. The harsh judgment quiets, and you realize you don't need to fight yourself so relentlessly. Here lies one of life's paradoxes. The more you accept yourself, the more room you create for growth. Shame doesn't transform us, awareness does. Clarity is what gives us choice. And in that clarity, you discover the power to pause instead of spiral, to respond instead of react. You begin to choose your values over your impulses, not because someone told you to, but because you've come to know who you are and what you stand for. That is real power. Not domination over others, not external control, but sovereignty, the ability to govern your own mind, to be the charioteer holding the reins, not the rider dragged helplessly behind. Freedom is not the absence of struggle. It is the awareness you bring to struggle. It is the recognition of your old patterns rising up and the decision right there to choose differently. It's also easy to forget how layered we truly are. Inside each of us is a choir of voices, some old, some new, some loud, some faint. They rarely agree, and that's okay. Harmony does not require uniformity. It requires listening, guiding, allowing even the voices of anger, sadness, or fear to be heard. They are not enemies to silence. They are signals, evidence that you've lived, that you've cared, that you've longed for more. When you finally give those parts of yourself a seat at the table, not to control you, but to be acknowledged, you stop being a stranger to your own soul. You become a home, not a flawless one, but an authentic one. From that place, something shifts. You stop needing to fix the world to feel whole, because you've learned the harder, more essential task, making peace with yourself. That doesn't mean you abandon justice or change. It means your actions flow from clarity rather than reactivity, from alignment rather than compensation. You no longer try to rescue others just to avoid rescuing yourself. The outer world will always have its battles, but the most important one, the one that decides how you show up in every relationship, every choice, every moment, is the one within. Win that, and the rest of life begins to align. Not perfectly, not instantly, but in a way that feels deeply meaningful. So the next time you feel restless, angry, numb, or lost, resist the urge to escape. Instead, pause, not to erase yourself, but to understand yourself. Because maybe the real war was never out there at all. Maybe it was always here, quiet, constant, and waiting for you to finally pay attention. And ask yourself this: how much of your anxiety comes not from the present moment, but from trying to control what was? Never yours to control. That heavy pressure in your chest, that endless carousel of thoughts at night, how much of it is caused by a mind grasping at the uncontrollable? We refresh our phones, check emails, obsess over opinions, plan for a future that refuses to be, predict it and replay a past that cannot be rewritten. And in doing so, we keep ourselves trapped in a cage with no lock. We spend so much of our lives chasing control, gripping tightly at every detail, as though life itself might unravel if we loosen our hold. We convince ourselves that if only we could be smarter, faster, better prepared, then maybe we could outmaneuver the chaos. But no matter how hard we pull on the strings, things still fall apart. That is, life, it moves forward whether we are ready or not. It can be messy, unpredictable, even cruel at times. And it certainly doesn't wait for our permission. Somewhere along the way, we bought into the illusion that endless effort could buy us certainty. But the truth is sobering. Trying to outrun chaos is a game no one wins. The chase only exhausts us. It convinces us we're failing, when in reality we're simply attempting the impossible, controlling what was never meant to be controlled. Socrates once said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for contentment is the wealth of nature." That kind of contentment doesn't come from forcing life into submission. It begins when we stop resisting what we cannot hold. The weather, the economy, the outcome of someone else's choices, the opinions they carry about us, these are outside our domain. Yet we treat them as if they were fragile machines needing constant adjustment. When they slip from our grasp, we mistake that friction for failure. But it isn't failure, it's simply the collision between our desires and reality. Is a deeper kind of peace that comes from knowing our limits. Not a weak, passive resignation, but a strong, grounded wisdom, the ability to distinguish between what is truly ours to shape and what is simply part of life's currents. Real responsibility doesn't mean controlling outcomes. It means owning your response, your effort, your integrity. Everything else is weather passing through. Carl Jung once wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And in that simple statement lies a reminder. Our true power exists in the space between stimulus and response. It's not found in bending life to our will, but in shaping how we move through its unpredictability. Think of how much unnecessary weight you carry every day, the moods of others, their words, their choices. You replay conversations, analyze what you should have said, imagine different endings, but those moments are gone. They offer lessons, not leashes. Learn what you can, and then let them go. Because control isn't always about domination. Sometimes, real control is the ability to release the illusion that if you think hard enough, try long enough, or plan carefully enough, you can guarantee perfection. Life doesn't work with guarantees. It works with seasons, cycles, and mysteries. Plato once compared the soul to a city. There are places we manage and places beyond our reach. Confuse those boundaries and chaos spreads. We overextend ourselves, become distracted, and lose orientation. And then we wonder why anxiety gnaws at us, why we lie awake at night, why nothing ever feels enough. The answer is simple. When you stretch yourself too thin between what you can influence and what you wish you could control, you lose touch with the only place anything real ever happens, the present. The past is memory. The future is possibility. But your breath, your choices, your actions, these exist here and now. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom." But knowing yourself also means recognizing your limits. It means being honest about what belongs to you and what never did. Not every thought deserves your energy. Not every discomfort demands a solution. Some things simply need to be witnessed, felt, and allowed to pass, like a storm rolling across the sea. We often assume peace will arrive once everything around us calms down, when the job is secure, when people finally understand us, when life aligns neatly. But peace is not something you wait for. It is something you create through clarity. Clarity about what is yours to carry and what you must release. That's the line where your power ends, your peace begins. The problem is that from childhood we're rewarded for solving, fixing, achieving. We grow into adults believing that effort equals control, that if something isn't working, it must be because we aren't trying hard enough. So we push harder, pile on more, shoulder burdens that aren't ours to hold. We confuse worry with responsibility, mistaking it for a moral compass. But often worry is just noise, not truth. It is a reaction, not a signal. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some things need patience. Some things demand presence rather than panic. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus framed it with radical simplicity. Some things are up to us and some things are not. That division holds incredible power. Wisdom is not only about knowing what to do. Sometimes it is knowing when to stop, when to breathe, when to surrender, not in weakness, but in strength, because surrender is not the same as giving up. Surrender is choosing not to waste your limited energy on what you cannot change. It is redirecting your gaze inward to the only place where transformation is always possible. Your thoughts, your habits, your character. That is where the true work begins. And it is enough. Letting go is not detachment from life. On the contrary, it is a deeper engagement with the parts that truly matter. When you release the illusion of control, you stop scattering your energy and start focusing on what you can influence. That's where freedom lies, not in managing the uncontrollable, but in mastering the space within. Your tone in a conversation, the patience you offer to someone you love, the discipline you bring to your goals. These are not small things. They are real, they are yours, and they matter more than you realize. The more you live from this grounded place, the more the background noise of life begins to fade. You feel less dragged by urgency and more rooted in clarity. You stop chasing the illusion of perfection and instead practice the art of presence. Soon, you begin to see that much of your anxiety was not a result of life being too much, but from holding too tightly to things that were never yours to carry. And when you loosen your grip, peace finds its way in, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because you stop fighting battles that were never meant to be fought. You stop answering questions that don't need answers. You stop trying to solve problems that were never yours. And in doing so, you start to live more fully in your own lane. With every decision you make from this place, you build a quiet kind of confidence. Not the loud, boastful kind, but a steady, unwavering assurance that comes from truly knowing yourself. You begin to understand where you end and where the world begins. You learn which burdens are yours to carry and which ones must be set down. And you recognize that peace is not a passive state. It is an active practice. That practice begins every time you pause and ask yourself, is this mine to carry? Because the truth is, not every emotion belongs to you. Not every expectation is your duty to fulfill. Not every fear is your responsibility to resolve. Some are inherited, passed down quietly through generations. Some are projected onto you by others who cannot carry their own weight. And some are nothing more than echoes from a past that no longer fits your present. The work isn't to control them all, but to recognize them and to choose consciously which ones you will let in. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's exactly what this practice is about. Not rewriting destiny, but reclaiming authorship of your own life. Not being tossed around by the winds of chance, but becoming the anchor in the storm. And storms will always come. But you will face them differently, not by gripping tighter, but by standing taller. Not by predicting every wave, but by trusting your ability to navigate. This presence is built on boundaries, on knowing what is yours and what isn't. That's the soil where peace can finally take root, not as an escape from life, but as a foundation for how to live it. From that place, you stop needing everything to go your way. You stop fearing discomfort. You begin to realize that you can handle far more than you once believed, not because you control everything, but because you are focused on the things you truly can control. Your choices, your clarity, your character. And when you operate from this center, your life begins to shift. Your decisions come from alignment, not anxiety. You connect from authenticity, not obligation. You show up with wholeness, not out of fear that you might miss something. And slowly but surely, the noise fades. The inner battle's quiet. The tension begins to ease. Not because the world has changed, but because you've recognized where your power ends and where your responsibility begins. You've stopped clinging to what was never yours. And in that release, you discover that the peace you were chasing was never out there. It was within you, all along, waiting for you to come home. Think of your mind as a fortress, a place meant to guard you, protect you, and give you clarity when the outside world grows loud. But what happens when the fortress has no walls? Or worse, when the walls are weak and crumbling? Thoughts rush in without filter. Emotions storm the gates. Fear settles itself on the throne. The result? Chaos within. So what does it really take to build those walls? Not walls that isolate, but walls that filter. Not walls that keep life out, but ones that allow you to choose what stays. It begins with attention, not scattered, overstimulated attention that jumps from one glowing screen to another, but deep, deliberate attention, the kind that listens, that notices, that sifts, because everything that enters your mind starts with what you choose to give attention to. Every headline, every conversation, every whispered fear or fragile hope, you let them in. Most of the time, not consciously. And over time, these small inputs shape the architecture of your inner world. They build your beliefs, fuel your fears, and carve out your cravings. Carl Jung said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." The same truth applies to the mind. You are not defined by what you claim to believe, but by what you repeatedly allow in. If your thoughts are constantly anxious, if your focus is always fractured, if your inner voice never stops criticizing, then the question must be asked, who built these walls? And more importantly, are they still serving you? Because not all walls are protective. Some are built from fear. Some are shaped by old wounds. And sometimes they block not just chaos, but connection. This is why building a stronghold of the mind doesn't mean becoming rigid or closed. It means becoming discerning. It means choosing wisely what deserves your energy and what doesn't. Plato believed that the first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. But this conquest is not about force. It is about patience and honesty. It is about pausing before reacting, sitting with discomfort instead of fleeing from it, saying no to what weakens and yes to what strengthens, even when that choice costs you. Every time you make a decision aligned with clarity, discipline, and humility, you add another brick to the walls of that stronghold. And those walls don't just become taller or thicker. they become smarter, more refined. They allow you to remain grounded, not shut off. They allow you to meet the storm without being swept away. But most of us were never taught this. We were trained to solve problems, not filter input. Rewarded for speed, not thoughtfulness. And in that rush, our minds have turned into marketplaces, loud, crowded, chaotic, where everyone is shouting for our attention. And we, trying to listen to them all, wonder why we are so overwhelmed. Socrates once warned, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." He knew something that we still wrestle with today, that noise does not equal progress, and constant movement does not guarantee growth. You can fill every hour of your day with tasks, deadlines, and conversations, and yet still end up lost, especially when your mind is wide open to everything, yet anchored to nothing. That isn't a fortress, it's a revolving door where every voice, every opinion, every fear comes and goes unchecked. So how do we begin to change that? It starts with awareness of what we consume, not only the food we eat or the media we scroll through, but the thoughts, conversations, and beliefs we let enter. Every word you hear, every post you pause on, every story you repeat, they all leave an imprint. Some will reinforce fear, others will quietly feed insecurity. A few may strengthen you, but if you're not paying attention, they blend into one restless blur, and soon that blur becomes your reality. This is why mental boundaries are essential. Asking yourself, does this deserve space in my mind? Isn't about arrogance or apathy, it's about protection. Not every opinion deserves your energy. Not every crisis requires your emotional investment. That's not indifference, it's strategy. Your inner space is limited, and what fills it will shape you. So choose content that aligns with truth and clarity, not with noise and chaos. Aristotle put it simply, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. The same principle applies to your inner life. You don't build a fortress of the mind in a single day. It's built brick by brick through consistent, intentional choices. Choosing a mindful walk over endless scrolling. Choosing a deep breath over a reactive outburst. Choosing reflection over judgment. These aren't just healthy habits. They're architecture. They build walls not to shut life out, but to give your thoughts structure and your emotions context. With practice, you begin to see the difference between thoughts that are mere passing weather and those that carry truth. You learn to recognize fear for what it is, loud and urgent, but not always accurate. And in that awareness, you stop reacting blindly. You start responding thoughtfully. Not because you've numbed yourself, but because you've created space for clarity. A stronghold doesn't crumble at the first sign of trouble. It evaluates, it chooses, it holds steady. Jung reminded us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about that. Every unexamined belief, every unchallenged story, every reactive pattern you've carried since childhood, they shape the architecture of your inner world. And unless you confront them, they will quietly dictate your future. This journey isn't only about building walls. It's about illuminating rooms. It's about meeting the hidden parts of yourself, the ones that mask their pain with sarcasm, with distraction, with perfectionism. They aren't there to ruin you. They're misguided attempts at protection. When you finally acknowledge them, When you see them for what they are, you can choose better guardians for the gates of your mind. Not fear, not ego, but wisdom, truth, and clarity. And clarity does not mean certainty. It doesn't promise you a perfect map of the future. What it gives you is focus, the ability to filter out the unnecessary so you can hold on to the essential. To recognize that your mind is not a dumping ground. It is sacred ground, and what you allow in will determine who you become. Let's not pretend this is easy. It isn't. There will be days when the noise is louder, when the walls feel weaker, when you let things in that you later regret. That's part of being human. But the more you return to awareness, the more you reclaim control. Not control over life itself, but control over yourself. Control over what you think, what you believe, and where you direct your focus. Over time, that becomes your real strength, because the strongest minds are not the ones that know everything. They are the ones that know what to ignore, what to release, and what to guard with vigilance. That is the kind of strength that endures. That is the fortress that allows not just survival, but growth. So when the world outside grows deafening, when your inner chatter rises, when everything feels too heavy, pause, breathe, remind yourself that not everything deserves entry into your sanctuary. Not every thought belongs in your sacred space. You get to choose every moment, every day, what bricks you lay in your inner stronghold. And then comes the deeper question. How do you let go without disconnecting? Is it really possible to care deeply without becoming enslaved by your emotions? These aren't surface-level curiosities. They are the questions that surface in heartbreak, disappointment, and overwhelming responsibility. When you've poured yourself into a relationship, a cause, or a dream, and it slips beyond your control, it's natural to ask, how do I keep my heart open without letting it break me? Because somewhere along the way, we were taught a false equation that to care means to carry. That if you love someone, you must absorb their pain. That if you're committed to something, you must tie your worth to its outcome. But that kind of fusion is a trap. It blurs the line between compassion and control, between empathy and self-destruction. And when caring turns into clinging, it becomes a cage. The bars may be invisible, but they're forged from guilt, anxiety, and obsession. What begins as love slowly morphs into self-erasure. Caring in itself is never the problem. Caring is beautiful. It is human. But when you equate caring with carrying everything, you lose yourself. You say yes when your heart is crying out for no. You start measuring your worth by how much you fix, save, or prove. And in the process, you forget who you are outside of all the holding. You try to manage what others feel, so you won't have to sit with your own discomfort. You stay longer than you should. You give more than you actually have, and you justify it all in the name of love or loyalty. But what if letting go wasn't the same as abandoning someone? What if letting go was actually a form of clarity? Plato once said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself." And part of that victory is learning where your love ends and another person's responsibility begins. This isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about preserving your sanity, your wholeness. Because the truth is sobering, you cannot carry someone else's growth. You cannot force them to heal, to change, to meet you halfway. You can only offer and then step back. And that step back will feel unnatural at first, especially when your heart is deeply invested. But there is a world of difference between standing beside someone and losing yourself trying to stand for them. The first is true connection. The second is emotional fusion. And fusion, though often romanticized in movies and stories, erodes your boundaries piece by piece. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your own whole person, was essential to mental health. That means standing apart from others, not above them. It means owning your emotions, your path, and your needs, without trying to live life through someone else's journey, without turning their wounds into your identity. Yet this healthy detachment is often misunderstood. Many assume letting go equals not caring, that it is cold or distant. In reality, it takes far more strength to love without control, to be present without being consumed, to witness another's struggle without rushing to rescue them. True maturity is realizing that supporting someone does not require sacrificing yourself. There is a quiet wisdom and restraint in watching someone fall, even when everything in you longs to catch them. Not because you want them to suffer, but because you honor their path. You understand that some lessons cannot be transferred, only lived. And trying to shield someone from those lessons is not kindness. It is interference. You may feel like you're protecting them, but in truth you're robbing them of the very struggle that could shape their resilience. Aristotle defined love as to will the good of the other. Notice their good, not your version of it. Not what feels safest or most convenient for you. Sometimes their good means allowing them to walk a road you can't travel for them. Sometimes it means releasing the version of them you once held in your mind. Letting go doesn't mean love has ended. It means love has grown into a healthier form, with open hands instead of clenched fists, with presence instead of pressure. But this kind of love requires practice, especially for those who are used to over-functioning. If you've been conditioned to fix, to please, to prove your worth through constant emotional labor, then boundaries will at first feel selfish. Saying, "This is not mine to carry," will feel wrong. You may even mistake guilt for love. But guilt is not love, it's a wound. And love, real love, does not demand your depletion. Socrates once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Nowhere is this truer than in our relationships. Without reflection, caring slips easily into control, and empathy into self-erasure. So ask yourself, is this compassion, or is it control? Am I truly helping, or am I protecting myself from discomfort? Do I trust this person's journey, or am I clinging to the version of them that I want them to be? These questions are difficult, but they expose the truth. Behind every tight grip is fear of abandonment, fear of being unnecessary, fear of fading into irrelevance. But you are not defined by your role in someone else's story. Your worth is not measured by how much comfort you provide. When you begin to unravel that illusion, you start to see clearly the difference between healthy care and emotional enslavement. You stop trying to rescue people from their process. You begin to realize that your peace matters too, because you cannot show up with real love if you are constantly showing up without boundaries. Boundaries, contrary to how they're often portrayed, are not walls. They are doors with locks. They don't close people out. They protect what is sacred inside. They say, I am here. I care, but I will not abandon myself to prove it. They preserve your energy, your clarity, your identity. And when your boundaries are strong, your love becomes cleaner, calmer, freer. Love without boundaries is tangled with fear, guilt, and expectation. Love with boundaries flows more honestly. It becomes something you offer freely, not something you trade for validation. Carl Jung once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." And that wisdom stretches beyond parenting. It applies to every relationship. When you silence your own needs, your truth, your individuality, just to keep someone else comfortable, you do not serve them. You burden them with your absence and with the quiet resentment that always grows when your own voice has been ignored for too long. To let go without disconnecting means to stand fully in your own selfhood while still remaining open. It is to say, I love you, but I will not lose me. It is understanding that connection does not require enmeshment. That true presence is not about merging into one identity, but about witnessing someone fully, respectfully, without rewriting their story with your own pen. And that, more than anything, requires emotional strength, patience, and trust, not just trust in others, but trust in yourself. Trust begins with your self-trust that you can survive disappointment without being destroyed by it, that you can sit with uncomfortable emotions without needing to fix or suppress them, that your worth as a human being does not rise and fall depending on how much you are needed. When you begin to build this trust, you loosen the compulsion to micromanage every emotional experience. And when the urge to fix inevitably surfaces, as it always does, you learn to pause, to breathe, to remind yourself that loving someone doesn't mean controlling their journey. It also means trusting their capacity to navigate pain, to stumble, to learn, and to grow at their own pace. Letting go becomes an act of faith, not abandonment. It becomes a declaration that you believe in something greater than fear, the intelligence of life itself. You begin to trust timing, trust the consequences that teach lessons you cannot teach for them. Trust that love does not have to smother to be real. You learn the difference between holding space and taking over, between saying, I'm here, and saying, let me fix this. You learn to feel fully without being enslaved by those feelings, to grieve without collapsing, to walk away without closing your heart. And when you love in this way, something remarkable unfolds. You start to experience love in return, that is, built on respect, not dependency. Relationships that don't demand constant performance or proof, but allow you to simply be openly and honestly. That kind of love doesn't bind you in chains, it frees you. It creates room for both people to breathe, to make mistakes, to evolve without the looming threat that one misstep will collapse everything. This space invites honesty. Neither of you is walking on eggshells, terrified that the other might shatter at the slightest disappointment. And so, yes, it is absolutely possible to care deeply without becoming emotionally enslaved. But it requires a shift. You must stop using care as currency for approval. Stop mistaking control for closeness. You'll know you are moving in the right direction when you notice that your feelings no longer own you, when you can watch someone you love struggle without spiraling into panic, when you can offer love without demanding anything in return, when you can finally say with quiet strength, I matter too, and believe it, the goal has never been detachment, it's discernment. The wisdom to know where you end and where another begins. That's how you let go without losing yourself. That's how you love without surrendering your peace. That's how you walk through life, both open and grounded, free yet connected. Before there is judgment, there is perception. And before perception, there is awareness. This is the path every thought takes before it solidifies into belief. The tragedy is that most of us skip over awareness entirely. We move too quickly, leaping into conclusions, assuming we've seen clearly, when in reality we've only reacted. We're not intentionally wrong, we're simply rarely still enough to actually see. The world moves fast, and so does the mind. And in that constant rush, we form impressions, quick, automatic, invisible, and mistake them for truth. But what if what we call truth is only a filtered version of reality, filtered through the lens of fear, desire, memory, and expectation? Plato illustrated this beautifully in his allegory of the cave people staring at shadows on a wall, believing they are seeing reality itself. In the same way, we often live not by truth, but by projections of our inner conditioning. This is how judgment becomes distorted. We judge others not by who they are, but by the roles we assign them. We judge ourselves not by what we are now, but by the ghosts of our past failures or the ideals we never met. Judgment itself isn't the enemy, the danger lies in what happens before judgment, because once your perception is filtered, every thought and every decision bends under that distortion. Awareness is the only force strong enough to interrupt this cycle. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That includes the way you see the world. If you've lived with the story that you're never enough, your perception will bend reality. To prove it, if fear has been your companion, silence will feel like danger. If pain has shaped you, you'll call your pessimism realism, when in truth it's just familiarity. Awareness doesn't demand that you force clarity, it grows from presence, from the willingness to notice without reacting, to observe a thought rising and allow it to pass without clinging or resisting. This sounds simple, but it is deeply difficult. The mind craves movement. It wants closure, not questions. Certainty, not ambiguity. But true awareness lives in that sacred pause before the mind rushes to define. Socrates taught that the only true wisdom is to know that you know nothing. This is not weakness, it is humility. It is the openness that allows you to question your own perspective, to admit that what you see may not be the full picture or even half. And in that pause, you create space for something transformative, curiosity. Curiosity is awareness in motion. It doesn't assume, it explores. It doesn't declare, it asks. Instead of saying, this is what it means, it wonders, what else could this mean? That subtle shift changes everything. It transforms reaction into response, habit, into insight. It reveals the gap between what is happening and the story you're telling yourself about what is happening. And in that gap, freedom begins, because perception is always a mirror. And mirrors do not show the world as it is, they reflect what you are ready to see. If your mind is crowded with judgment, you will see flaws everywhere. If your heart is heavy with comparison, you will see another's success as your failure. If resentment fills your chest, even kindness will look suspicious. Change your inner world and the outer world begins to shift. This is why awareness must come before perception, because perception always flows out of the state of your being. Aristotle put it well, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. That is awareness, the ability to hold space for possibilities without rushing to claim any of them as permanent truth, to let thoughts rise and let them go if they don't serve you. Yet ask yourself honestly, how often do you pause to question whether your perception is accurate? Most of us live on autopilot. We hear a tone and assume anger. We catch a glance and assume judgment. We remember an old wound and interpret the present through its lens. The brain, efficient and impatient, loves shortcuts. But shortcuts in perception often lead us away from truth. Awareness is not about speed, it's about depth. It's about noticing the shortcut your mind wants to take and also recognizing the longer, slower road beside it, then asking yourself, which path truly serves you? And often awareness doesn't show us flattering truths. Sometimes it reveals that we are projecting, that we're clinging, that we're shaping our assumptions more from fear than from facts. But facing those truths is not failure. It is growth, because awareness doesn't demand that we are always right. It asks only that we are honest about what is really there, even when it feels uncomfortable. And honesty, when rooted in awareness, doesn't need to be harsh. It can be gentle. It can be as simple as saying to yourself, this is what I'm feeling. This is the story I'm telling myself. But is it the only story? From that place, you can question without shame. You can shift without forcing yourself. You can change perspective not because you were wrong, but because you are seeing with clearer eyes. And this doesn't apply only to how we see others. It applies even more profoundly to how we see ourselves. How much of your self-judgment still comes from labels others gave you years ago, from the stories you inherited as a child, from a single mistake, or from someone else's projection of their fears onto you? These stories become the lens through which we see ourselves and, by extension, how we see the entire world. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege requires clarity, and clarity often requires unlearning just as much as learning. It means stepping back from the roles you've played: dutiful child, reliable friend, tireless worker, and asking yourself, is this really me? Or is this who I thought I had to be? The more aware you become, the more you notice that sacred space between stimulus and response. That pause becomes holy ground, because in that pause lies choice, the chance to decide what kind of person you want to be, not from impulse but from intention, not from fear but from wisdom. That is where you stop allowing fear to dictate your choices and begin shaping your actions from clarity. And this awareness reshapes your judgments. You stop rushing to slap labels on people, not because you can't see differences, but because you begin to see beyond the surface. You recognize that every person has a backstory that most outward, Behavior reflects an inward battle. Anger often conceals pain. Arrogance often shields fear. Emotional distance often hides something fragile that someone is trying to protect. Awareness creates compassion, not the cheap kind that excuses harmful behavior, but the grounded kind that seeks to understand context. You don't excuse harm, but you do see the full picture before rushing to condemn. And that softens your judgments. You stop using labels like weapons. You start listening, not just to others, but to yourself. And listening itself becomes a form of awareness. Listening without rehearsing your rebuttal. Listening without immediately trying to fix. Listening for what lies underneath the words. Because most people aren't asking for answers, they are asking to be seen, and you cannot see them if your mind is busy with assumptions, just as you cannot hear yourself if you are always busy. Correcting your own emotions instead of feeling them, perception sharpens in stillness. Not emptiness, but alert presence. When you let go of the urge to control, when you stop narrating your experience and simply witness it, even for a single breath, you begin to see reality as it is, not as you fear or wish it to be. And there, in that seeing, peace begins, because suffering rarely comes from the moment itself. It comes from the stories we attach to the moment. Anxiety doesn't come only from what is happening now, but from our imagined futures. Shame doesn't arise from an event alone, but from the harsh narrative we've woven around it. Awareness peels away those layers until what remains is rarely as terrifying as we believed, even in grief, even in failure, even in loss. When you meet life's hardest moments with pure awareness, you discover something steady beneath the storm, a ground that doesn't require numbing or escape, a clarity that simply sees. And in that seeing, healing quietly begins. So perhaps the real question is not, can you stop judging? But, can you see clearly before you judge? Can you pause before you react? Can you become aware of the lens through which you are looking? That is the practice. Not perfection, not some grand enlightenment, but daily noticing. Gentle, patient noticing that begins to change everything. Because with practice, you stop being a prisoner of your first impressions. You stop living trapped in the projections of your past. You begin to move through the world with more choice, more understanding, more peace, and you realize something liberating. Perception is not fixed, it is shaped. It is learned, and because of that, it can be reshaped. Awareness gives you the chance to reshape your perception, not into what you fear, not into what you hope, but into what is actually true. And from that truth, you gain something rare in today's world. Presence. Think about this split second between what happens to you and what you choose to do next. That pause is so brief it almost goes unnoticed. A glance, a message, a sharp word, an unexpected bill, a loud noise, or a wave of emotion suddenly. Your heart skips, your mind races, your body tenses. Before you even realize it, you've already spoken or shut down, lashed out, or withdrawn. Most of the time, it happens so quickly we forget it was ever a choice, but it was. That flicker of space between stimulus and response is where you're true. Power lives. Not the flashy kind of power that demands attention, but the silent kind that transforms your life from the inside out. Psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl described it best. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And Frankl knew better than most what it meant to face unimaginable suffering and still claim that space. Yet, how many of us actually live there? Most of the time we live in reaction, not because we are weak, but because we've been conditioned to move fast. Society rewards speed. Answer now, decide now, respond now. Don't stop. In that constant rush, we forget the power of the pause. We forget that slowing down, even for a breath, can completely change the direction of our lives. What if the greatest shifts in who you become aren't decided in the big, dramatic moments, but in those tiny, ordinary seconds? You're criticized. Do you snap back defensively, or pause to breathe and respond with clarity? Someone disappoints you. Do you attack from hurt, or pause and speak from honesty instead of accusation? Fear rises. Do you run, or do you pause? Long enough to ask what it's trying to teach you. Plato said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself." That victory doesn't happen on battlefields. It happens in those hidden moments, in that split second where your inner world collides with the outer one and you decide who you will be. That space is where habits form. It's where you either fall into old grooves or carve out new ones. The more you bring awareness into that space, the more strength you build. Not strength to control the world, but strength to guide yourself, to respond in ways aligned with your values rather than your fears. And yet, awareness doesn't come naturally. When stress hits, your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, priming you for survival. Your heart pounds, your vision narrows, your instincts shout. React. That's your nervous system trying to protect you, but it's wired for survival, not wisdom. If you never train that space, you'll remain caught in the same cycles, reacting from instinct instead of responding from clarity. That's why the pause matters. It is not just a breath, it is the meeting point between who you were and who you can become. In that pause, you ask yourself, am I about to replay the old story, or am I about to write a new one? And each time you choose with awareness, you strengthen your ability to live intentionally. Carl Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And this is exactly what happens when we skip the pause. We act out old scripts, unconscious patterns, emotional reflexes that we never chose. We think we're deciding, but really our past is deciding for us. The way out isn't complicated. You don't need to retreat to a monastery or meditate for hours a day. You only need to practice noticing. Just notice. When a trigger appears, pause. When judgment rises, pause. When the impulse to lash out surges, pause. Even one breath can save you from slipping into autopilot. That single breath is a lifeline. It interrupts the chain of reaction and creates space for reflection. And reflection is what gives you choice. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Examination doesn't mean endless overthinking. It means slowing down just enough to see yourself in motion, to notice what you're about to say, to feel your emotions rise and then ask, is this who I want to be right now? And maybe you still choose to speak up. Maybe you choose to walk away. The point isn't perfection. The point is choice. It's no longer reflex. It's no longer fate. It's you stepping into that space and deciding. That is the real work, training the pause until it becomes your sanctuary. And like a muscle, the more you practice, the stronger it gets. You begin to notice it in new places. You catch the thought before it becomes a full story, the anger before it becomes an explosion, the fear before it becomes avoidance. And each time you choose better. This doesn't make you flawless. It makes you present. And presence changes everything. Because when you're present, you're no longer owned by your impulses. You're not enslaved by the need to be right or the fear of being wrong. You're simply here awake, alive, intentional. And from that place, your words carry more weight. Your actions carry more depth. Aristotle reminded us that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But true self-knowledge goes deeper than personality tests or knowing your preferences. It means knowing your triggers, knowing your defense mechanisms, knowing the lies your mind tells you when it's afraid, and still choosing to act from truth rather than fear. That is what happens in the space between stimulus and response. You don't just meet the moment, you meet yourself. Not the curated version, but the raw one. The part of you that flinches when criticized, that withdraws when you feel unheard, that sabotages when life gets too good. And in that space you get to decide, will you let those patterns rule you, or will you rise above them? Awareness makes what was hidden suddenly visible, and visibility gives you power. When you learn to practice the pause, you aren't just avoiding mistakes, you're rewriting your story one choice, one moment at a time. You're choosing growth over comfort, integrity over impulse, wisdom over blind reaction, and of course, there will still be times you react without thinking. There will be moments when the space feels too small to enter. That's not failure. The point isn't perfection. The point is practice. Each time you return to the pause, each time you remember that you have a choice, your life begins to shift. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you have changed. You grow less reactive, more intentional. Less tossed around by chaos, more rooted in clarity. You begin to trust yourself, not because you always know the right answer, but because you know how to find the space before answering. That trust doesn't arrive overnight. It builds slowly, like strength gained through steady training. And it shows up everywhere, in your relationships, your work, even in how you handle failure. You stop spiraling over every mistake. You stop drowning in every disagreement. You begin to choose from calm, not chaos. That is the quiet but powerful gift of the pause. And the beauty is, it's always available. No matter how noisy or overwhelming life becomes, that space is waiting. In your breath and your awareness, in that 1 second where you remind yourself, I'm not a slave to my emotions. I am their guide. So the next time something shakes you, pause, even for a heartbeat, even for one slow inhale. That second can rewrite the story. That second is your power, and the more you use it, the more your life reflects intention instead of reactivity. But then comes the deeper question. Who are you when there's no one to impress, nothing to prove, no audience to validate you? It's a confronting thought. Most people go through life without stopping long enough to truly ask it. And when they finally do, the answers often feel uncomfortable, because so much of what we believe ourselves to be is built from mirrors reflections of what others see, approve of, or reject. We learn to shape ourselves to match expectations. Often before we even realize it, approval becomes like oxygen. The praise of others becomes the metric of our worth. But what happens when the audience is gone? When there are no more compliments, no stage, no applause, who shows up then? Strip away the titles, the achievements, the curated image you present to the world. What remains? At some point, you will be alone with yourself. Not lonely, but truly alone. No one to watch, no one to reassure you, no one to validate you. Just you, your thoughts, your choices, the habits you've repeated, and the values you've actually lived by. Not the ones you talk about at dinner parties or post on social media, but the ones you demonstrate in silence when life is hard and no one is looking. That's where the real self lives. In the patterns, in the invisible choices, in the small, consistent acts that reveal who you really are. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were told to be, not who you thought you had to be to fit in, who you truly are beneath the layers." And that journey doesn't begin with adding more. It begins with peeling back, with letting go of the constant need to perform, with releasing the belief that your worth is tied to productivity, appearance, or compliance with expectations. So much of life trains us to look outward for identity, to chase it through status, through recognition, through being useful to others. But identity is not something you find out there. It is something you uncover in here, beneath the noise, beneath the roles, beneath the scripts you've been handed and the ones you've told yourself. Think of how much energy we burn trying to maintain an image. The way we adjust our opinions to fit the crowd. The way we silence our emotions just to look composed. The way we exaggerate, soften, or edit the truth depending on who's listening. At first, it feels like survival, a way to avoid rejection. But over time, it becomes a prison. The more we shape ourselves for others, the more we lose the shape of our own soul. And the cost of that is steep. We become strangers to our values. We say yes when our hearts whisper no. We chase dreams that were never ours. We get so good at performing that we forget how to simply be. Until one day, the applause fades, the audience disappears, and we are left asking a question that shakes us to the core. Who am I, really? Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Harsh, perhaps, but his meaning was simple. Without reflection, we drift. We become products of other people's expectations, instead of active creators of our own lives. We confuse attention with meaning. We chase relevance instead of authenticity. And in that chase, we miss the point entirely. Because at the end of your life, it will not matter how many people applauded you. It will matter whether you approve of the life you lived, whether you can sit with yourself in silence and feel at peace, whether your actions aligned with your values even when no one was watching, whether your private integrity matched your public image. This isn't about perfection, it's about honesty, about asking what parts of my life are truly mine. What beliefs do I hold when I'm not trying to please anyone? What remains when there is nothing to gain and no one to impress? Aristotle told us, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And yet, most people don't know themselves. They know their resume, They know their reputation. They know their roles. But when those fade, and they always will, what remains is character. That quiet force that determines how you treat those who can offer you nothing in return, how you act when there is no praise, how you speak when there is no audience. True character isn't built in the spotlight. It is revealed in the shadows. Character is not built under the spotlight, it's built in the shadows, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when there are no points to be scored, no applause to earn. It's built when you bend down to pick up the trash no one saw you drop, when you choose kindness over the cheap thrill of being right, when you admit your flaws without turning vulnerability into a performance for attention. There is something powerful, almost liberating, about becoming the kind of person you yourself would admire, even if no one else notices. Because that's where freedom truly begins. Freedom lives in the release of needing to be seen in a certain way, and the relief of not having to wear a mask, and the quiet confidence of knowing that your essence does not change depending on who's in the room. But that kind of self-ownership doesn't come cheaply. It takes time, patience, and above all, courage. It means letting some people down, people who prefer the version of you that bent, that entertained. It means saying no to things that once gave you a sense of importance. It means choosing solitude over shallow validation. And yes, it means risking being misunderstood for the sake of being true. Yet that is the trade-off. You surrender performance, and in return you gain peace. You lose the image but discover your identity. And what you find may surprise you. Perhaps you are softer than you've allowed yourself to show. Perhaps you are stronger than others ever suspected. Perhaps your deepest values have little to do with status or success, and everything to do with connection, integrity, and meaning. Carl Jung once said, "I'd rather be whole than good." That truth lands differently when you realize how often we trade wholeness for goodness, for approval, for belonging, for safety. Being good by someone else's standards usually comes at a cost. Silencing your voice, hiding your edges, compressing yourself to fit into someone else's mold. But wholeness is different. Wholeness is raw, unedited. It includes your contradictions. It welcomes both your ambition and your vulnerability, your darkness and your longing to be loved. Wholeness doesn't cut you into pieces, it embraces you as you are. And the more you own that wholeness, the less you need to prove yourself. Because proof is only demanded when there is uncertainty. When you have done the inner work, faced your fears, questioned your motives, examined your patterns, you no longer need to broadcast your worth. It reveals itself in how you move, how you love, how you live. So, who are you without the audience? Maybe that's where real life begins, not in chasing applause, but in living aligned. When you start caring less about appearances and more about how things feel on the inside. When your actions stop being performances for others and start being affirmations of who you are. That's the kind of presence people remember, not because it shouts, but because it radiates from within. It's the quiet gravity of someone who's done the work, faced the mirror, and chosen to live from the inside out. And people will notice, maybe not immediately, maybe not with applause, but over time they will feel it in your calm. They will sense it in your steady words, in your refusal to be dragged into unnecessary drama, because you're no longer living for the stage. You're living for what matters, for what endures. And what endures is not the spotlight, it is your integrity, your clarity, the ability to look back and say, I lived as myself, not as a performance, not as a projection, but as me. But then another question arises. Why is it that wanting more so often leaves us with less? Could freedom come not from adding, but from subtracting? It's strange how the pursuit of more can quietly shrink our lives. More success, more possessions, more validation, more attention. We chase it believing it will finally make us whole. Yet somewhere in that endless pursuit, something vital slips away. We lose clarity. We lose peace. We lose ourselves trying to catch a version of happiness that always hovers just one step ahead, like a mirage in the desert. More promises fulfillment, but delivers fatigue. You get the promotion, and it's not enough. You upgrade your lifestyle, but contentment still doesn't come. You gain more followers, more money, more choices, and still that quiet unease whispers, why doesn't this feel like it should? The problem is not wanting more. Desire itself is natural. The problem is the belief that more will finally, silence the hunger inside. But the moment you reach it, more moves the finish line. What once thrilled you quickly becomes the new normal, just another box checked off. And the cycle continues. Carl Jung warned. The more compulsively one tries to complete oneself through external achievements, the more alienated one becomes from the inner self. He saw clearly what we keep forgetting, that the more we grasp outside ourselves, the further we drift from what actually nourishes us. The truth is, peace doesn't come from addition, it comes from subtraction, from removing what doesn't serve, from simplifying what has grown bloated, from clearing space for what actually matters. And subtraction doesn't mean deprivation. It doesn't mean withdrawing from life. It means living deliberately, with clarity. It means making space for the self you've buried beneath the noise of constant accumulation. Subtraction is not about loss. It's about peeling back the unnecessary layers that have been smothering the core of who you really are. Think about it. Subtraction creates space. And in that space you find room again to breathe, to think, to feel. When you strip away distractions, your own voice, long buried under noise, starts to become audible. When you clear the clutter, physical, emotional, mental, you stop spending all your energy managing chaos and begin living with intention. That is where freedom quietly begins. But here's the challenge. We are rarely taught to subtract. We're taught to accumulate. From school, culture, and media, the message is the same: add more. More skills, more possessions, more experiences, more titles. And yes, there is value in growth, but growth without direction becomes self-inflicted chaos. You keep adding and adding until you can no longer remember what you were trying to build. In the first place, more tools, less clarity. More input, less wisdom. Socrates said, "He is richest who is content with the least." He wasn't glorifying poverty. He was pointing to perspective. True wealth isn't measured by how much you have, it's measured by how little you need to feel complete. When your needs are simple, your freedom expands. You are no longer weighed down by endless striving. You are no longer running after things that leave you empty. You step off the race that has no finish line. There is real strength in choosing less, in saying no when the world pressures you to say yes, in keeping your circle smaller, your schedule lighter, your goals aligned with your values, rather than your insecurities. Because when your life is flooded with noise, even the most important signals get drowned out. But when you strip away the excess, the signal sharpens. You start noticing what truly energizes you, what deeply matters, what burdens you've been carrying that were never yours to carry in the first place. And this subtraction is not just about things. It's about thoughts, expectations, old beliefs, and inherited voices that whisper lies into your mind. That voice that tells you your worth depends on how much you achieve. That anxiety that insists you are falling behind. That guilt that punishes you when you dare to rest. These are the invisible weights that keep us sprinting on the treadmill of more. The only way off that treadmill is through conscious subtraction, letting go of the story that your value is tied to output. Aristotle once said, "Nature does nothing in vain," and yet we fill our days with activities, meetings, notifications, and goals that serve no true purpose. Performances we never questioned, obligations we never chose. Over time, all this noise builds into a mountain of emotional clutter, a backlog of unprocessed pressure. And that's why so many of us live feeling perpetually behind, endlessly busy, but rarely fulfilled. Freedom doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means releasing what drains you and choosing instead what sustains you. Sometimes that looks like less money but more meaning, less status but more presence, less doing but more being. And yes, this takes courage because stepping away from the chase often means stepping away from what society labels as success. But what is success worth if it leaves you anxious, exhausted, and disconnected from yourself? Carl Jung observed, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And isn't that what overaccumulation often is? A distraction, a way of keeping busy so we don't have to sit in silence and feel. We pack our calendars so we don't have to ask harder questions. We pile on more goals, more noise, more consumption, because stillness feels too exposed. But silence is exactly where truth waits. It's in the quiet moments, unfiltered and unguarded, that you remember who you are, not the version you're trying to become, not the persona you project, but your raw, present self. And in those moments you realize how little you truly need to feel whole. A handful of honest relationships, a few meaningful efforts, a safe, quiet space, a healthy body, a clear mind. That is richness. That is enough. But living with enough is not a one-time revelation. It's a practice. It comes through daily decisions. Asking yourself, is this adding meaning or just adding weight? Choosing intention over impulse. Accepting that doing less may actually help you live more. And yes, the world won't always understand. It may label you lazy, unambitious, even strange. But you're not here to impress the world. You're here to live in alignment with your soul. Plato once described the soul as being pulled in different directions toward reason, spirit, and appetite. When appetite dominates, when the craving for more drives everything, you lose balance, you lose harmony. And the task of a thoughtful life is not to eliminate desire, but to reorder it, to align appetite with your values, to want less not, out of numbness but out of clarity. Clarity is the reward of subtraction. Clarity reveals not only what you want, but why you want it, not only who you are, but who you no longer need to be. That is what minimalism at its core truly means, not a sterile aesthetic, but a mindset, a stripping away of what clouds your vision so you can walk forward with more purpose and less noise. You begin making different choices. You stop saying yes to every opportunity simply because it exists. You say no more often, not to shut out life, but to create space for what truly belongs. You learn to sit with discomfort rather than bury it under distractions. You grow slower but deeper. You spread less, but you root more firmly. And in time, the hunger for more begins to quiet. Not because you've surrendered or given up, but because you've finally fed the deeper need, the need to be present, to be aligned, to be whole. Wholeness doesn't come from having everything you want. Wholeness comes from knowing what you no longer need and finding peace in letting it go. Letting go isn't about losing, it's about refining. It's about trusting that when you strip away what is unnecessary, you are making space for what is essential. It's choosing depth over breadth, being fully present in one place instead of halfway everywhere, doing fewer things but doing them well, being truly known by a few people instead of superficially admired by many. That's where real freedom lives. And it's not the loud, dramatic freedom we often imagine. It's the quiet, steady kind, the freedom of waking up without pressure, breathing without guilt, and living without that endless itch for more. And ironically, this kind of freedom begins to attract the things that actually matter. People can sense when you are living from clarity instead of craving, from wholeness instead of hunger. So maybe the next step in your life isn't to add anything new. Maybe it's to ask, what can I remove? What is weighing you down, cluttering your mind, blocking your view? Maybe it's time to let go of an outdated goal, a comparison that keeps you small, or a belief that was never really yours. Maybe it's time to clear the path, not so you can grab more, but so you can finally feel enough. Because sometimes less makes space for more. Sometimes subtraction becomes the most powerful addition, and sometimes the freedom you've been chasing isn't in the next achievement, but in the space that opens when you stop chasing. So how do you remain unmoved when everything around you demands constant motion? In a culture that rewards the fast, the loud, the endlessly busy, stillness itself feels like rebellion. You're expected to keep going, keep striving, keep producing. And if you pause even for a moment, it feels like you're falling behind, as though your worth disappears the second your output slows. But what if real strength isn't in perpetual motion, but in the ability to stand still when everything else is pulling you forward? Stillness isn't stagnation. It isn't laziness or passivity. Stillness is presence. It is the quiet resistance to being dragged in 100 directions by things that may not matter at all. It is choosing to respond instead of react. It is rootedness in the middle of restlessness. And that kind of steadiness requires far more power than speed ever could. Plato believed the soul was most harmonious when ruled by reason, not by appetite or raw emotion. And in many ways, constant motion is just appetite and fear in disguise. You move because you crave more, or you move because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. You chase attention, status, approval, or security, believing peace lies at the finish line. But peace has never been in the chase. It is found in the stillness, in the ability to remain centered while the world spins on. Of course, that's not easy in a world of constant motion. Social media screams that everyone else is doing more, achieving more, living more. Notifications buzz like alarms, demanding urgency. Even your mind becomes restless, leaping from task to task, thought to thought, driven by the subtle fear that rest equals failure. Carl Jung once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." To look inward, you must first stop moving. Not forever, just long enough to notice what is actually happening inside. Because awareness does not live in chaos, it lives in stillness. Without it, you may move through life constantly, but you never truly feel like you are living. Stillness is how you reclaim your time, your thoughts, your voice. It is where you meet yourself again after being lost in the noise. But it takes courage to pause, especially in a world that confuses stillness with weakness. It takes self-trust to step out of the rush and declare, "I don't need to move just because everyone else is moving." It takes discernment to see the difference between meaningful action and motion for motion's sake. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things beyond our control." And isn't most of our frantic motion born from trying to control the uncontrollable? Other people's opinions, the pace of progress, the uncertainty of the future. The more you try to manage those things, the more frantic you become, believing you must keep moving just to hold everything together. But real freedom arrives when you sit with the discomfort of uncertainty without rushing to fix it. When you realize your peace isn't tied to everything going your way. When you no longer need to prove your worth to feel worthy. That is the power of stillness. It is restraint, calm, the strength to not act when action would only scatter your energy. Aristotle taught that virtue lives in moderation and balance. And balance demands awareness, to know when to step forward and when to hold your ground, when to speak and when to listen, when to push and when to let go. Motion without awareness leads to burnout. Motion guided by presence becomes rhythm, and rhythm creates space for silence. The more you cultivate stillness, the more you begin to notice what actually matters. You realize how much energy is wasted reacting to headlines, drama, or imagined futures. You recognize how often your movement was just avoidance, avoiding pain, avoiding silence, avoiding the truth. But discomfort isn't your enemy. It's a doorway. Stillness gives you the key. When you stop running, you finally hear what the discomfort has been trying to say. Maybe it's grief that has gone unprocessed. Maybe it's a decision you've been postponing. Maybe it's a truth you've avoided long enough. Whatever it is, it won't destroy you. What destroys us is constant avoidance. Socrates once said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." But you cannot build anything meaningful if you are constantly scattered. Stillness gathers your energy. It brings you back to yourself. And from that place, real change can finally begin. If your mind is scattered in 10 different places while your soul is in none, stillness is what gathers you back into yourself. It grounds you. It steadies your steps. It gives you the power to choose your direction instead of being dragged forward by sheer inertia. That simple pause, the ability to stop and ask, is this really where I want to go? Is where transformation begins. Without it, you live on repeat. You mistake movement for progress and wonder endlessly why nothing feels different. But stillness breaks the cycle. It interrupts the loop. It helps you act with intention, not out of reflex. You stop reacting blindly and begin to align your actions with who you truly want to be. Sometimes the greatest show of strength isn't charging forward, it's refusing to move, not out of fear, but out of focus. Because you've realized the world will always demand more of you. But wisdom is learning to listen inward instead of being pushed around outward. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. It's the kind of wisdom that comes only when you tune out the noise long enough to remember what you actually stand for. Jung taught that beneath all the shifting roles and masks, the performer, the pleaser, the achiever, there is a true self. That true self doesn't need motion to prove it exists. It doesn't need applause or approval. It only needs stillness to be seen. To remain unmoved doesn't mean you resist growth. It means you refuse unconscious change. It means you don't let comparison or fear dictate your next step. It means you trust your timing. You understand that not every opportunity is meant for you. Not every invitation is aligned. That sometimes the most meaningful growth happens quietly, beneath the surface, in silence and waiting. And there is peace in that kind of patience. Peace in knowing you don't need to chase every trend. Peace in being okay with missing out, because you're not here to experience everything. You're here to experience what is yours. And if you never slow down, you'll never know what that is. That's the irony. Motion makes us think we're living, when often it only distracts us from life. The most alive moments rarely come in a rush. They appear in slowness, a real conversation, a steady breath, the sunrise you finally stop to watch, the calm that follows when a hard truth is accepted. These moments don't demand motion. They demand presence. Presence is the real destination, not applause, not achievement. Presence. Because when you are present, you don't need to force life into shape. You don't need to prove or impress or grasp. You are simply here awake, aware, alive. And from that place, even your smallest actions gain weight. Even your ordinary movements become sacred. So how do you stay unmoved in a world that never stops moving? By choosing stillness, not as an escape, but as a return to clarity, to authenticity, to self. By reminding yourself you don't have to keep up, you only have to show up fully. By knowing your worth is measured not in speed, but in depth. By learning to listen more than you speak, to feel more than you perform, to be more than you produce. Stillness isn't a pause from life. Stillness is life. The part of it that doesn't need permission, that doesn't need noise, that just is steady, rooted, free. But here's the paradox. While stillness grounds you, discomfort grows you. What happens when you deliberately train your body and mind to do difficult things? What kind of strength is born in discomfort that comfort could never teach? Most people spend their lives chasing comfort, and it makes sense. Comfort feels good. It's soft, predictable, unthreatening. It doesn't demand risk. It doesn't push you to stretch. You can stay warm, untouched, unchallenged. But here's the hard truth. Comfort never made anyone stronger. Comfort never taught resilience. comfort never forced you to grow. All it does is maintain what already exists. The discomfort, on the other hand, is a ruthless but honest teacher. It's sharp. It's unforgiving. It doesn't care if you're ready. It drags you into the unknown and holds up a mirror, not to harm you, but to reveal what you've been avoiding. And when you stop running from it, when you choose to lean into discomfort, not out of punishment, but out of a desire to grow, something shifts. You begin to meet parts of yourself you would never meet in ease. Aristotle reminded us, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. When you make a habit of doing hard things on purpose, you don't just grow capable, you grow confident. Not loud confidence, but quiet certainty. The kind that says, I've been here before, I've faced the storm, I know I can endure. Doing hard things on purpose isn't about seeking pain for pain's sake. It's about building capacity. It's about teaching your nervous system to stay calm in chaos, to hold discomfort without collapsing. It's choosing to lift heavier when your body wants to stop, to run farther when your legs beg for rest, to speak the truth when silence would be easier, to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of numbing them. These are small acts daily. Choices, but repeated consistently, they rewire you. Carl Jung said, the difference between a good life and a bad life is how well you walk through fire. And fire doesn't always mean crisis. Sometimes the fire is ordinary, waking up early when you don't want to, keeping a promise when it's inconvenient, facing the conversation you'd rather avoid. Every fire faced strengthens you, showing up for the task you'd rather avoid, practicing discipline when no one is there to applaud. That is fire. Fire is not just crisis or catastrophe. It is anything that drags you out of ease and into effort. And effort changes you. With every rep at the gym, every awkward but necessary conversation, every new skill that feels impossible at first, your edge expands, your mental and emotional capacity stretches. And once you've touched that kind of strength, comfort stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like a cage. Plato believed that real learning never came from being told, it came from experience, from wrestling with reality, from discovering truth through struggle. Discomfort teaches in the same way. It strips down the stories you've carried about your limits. Most of the boundaries you believe in aren't real. They're inherited, absorbed, untested. And discomfort has a way of exposing them. It doesn't let you hide behind plans or potential. It asks for proof. It asks, what are you willing to endure to become the person you claim you want to be? And the answer doesn't need to be grand. It doesn't require heroic gestures. It requires consistency. Because consistency and discomfort is what forges grit. And grit is what carries you when motivation disappears, when excitement fades, when the goal feels far away. Growth isn't always about adding more knowledge or more tools. Sometimes it's about subtracting less avoidance, fewer excuses, less waiting until it feels convenient. Every time you choose to face what is hard, you change the way you see yourself. You begin to trust that you are someone who follows through, someone who chooses courage over convenience. That identity becomes your anchor. Socrates said, "It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable." And strength is never born in comfort. It is born in resistance, in repetition, in effort. And this applies not just to your body, but to your mind and spirit. Your mind grows strong when you sit in silence despite restlessness, when you stay focused despite constant distractions, when you choose kindness even while irritation is clawing at you. Those small, invisible acts are strength, and they matter because the world will test you. Loss, rejection, uncertainty, they come for everyone. None of us escape. The only question is, will you be ready when they arrive? You don't prepare for hardship by wishing it away. You prepare by practice by choosing daily to lean into challenge, not because it's fun, but because it shapes character. And character is what carries you when life goes off script. In a culture obsessed with shortcuts, convenience, 2-day shipping, instant results, and constant entertainment, deliberately doing hard things feels almost rebellious, like swimming against the current. But maybe that's exactly the point. Resistance is what builds resilience. The moments when you want to quit, but don't, that's where your real strength is revealed. And yes, discomfort will sting. It's supposed to. Growth is friction. It's you against your limits. You against your excuses. You against that voice in your head whispering, "This is too much." But here's the secret. You will come to recognize that voice. And over time, you'll learn to answer it not with force or rage, but with resolve, with patience, with a steady willingness to keep going. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the parts of yourself you usually push away. When you choose discomfort, those hidden parts rise to the surface. Your fear, your doubt, your hunger for approval, your impatience. And instead of running from them, you finally meet them. You start to work with them. You grow not despite them, but because you've faced them head-on. Discipline, then, is not punishment. It is self-respect. It is saying, I care enough about who I am becoming to step into discomfort. It is setting a standard, not because someone else demands it, but because you demand it of yourself. Over time, that standard becomes your baseline. It becomes who you are, and something interesting happens. Once you begin to do hard things deliberately, your fear of them shrinks. You realize they were never as unbearable as your mind made them out to be. Most of the pain was in anticipation, not in reality. The hardest part was rarely the work itself, it was starting. And once you begin, you discover a quiet truth. You are far more capable than you thought. Aristotle taught that virtue is not about extremes, but about doing the right thing in the right way for the right reason. Choosing discomfort is no different. It's not about punishment or pride. It's about alignment. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't collapse when life gets hard, because you've trained for it not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And over time, something profound happens. Discomfort becomes familiar. Not easier, but less intimidating. You begin to welcome it because you recognize it for what it is, the doorway. And every time you walk through it, you emerge more focused, more grounded, more yourself. That's the paradox. The very things that once scared you, difficult conversations, early mornings, heavy lifts, uncertain decisions, they stop holding the same power over you, because little by little you've reclaimed that power, not by control, but by courage. The courage to face discomfort is the courage to say, this is where I grow. And what grows in discomfort? Humility, patience, grit, emotional range, integrity. The kind of character that doesn't need to announce itself because it speaks quietly through how you show up steady, capable, clear, and it all begins with one choice, the decision to stop avoiding what's hard and start welcoming it. That's the paradox when you choose discomfort. Life doesn't suddenly get easier. It becomes more manageable because you become stronger. Your capacity stretches. Your tolerance deepens. Your peace expands. The challenges that once felt unbearable become milestones that mark your progress. So what happens when you deliberately train your body and your mind to embrace difficulty? You stop waiting for life to hand you easy seasons. You stop fearing struggle. You stop mistaking comfort for joy. Instead, you become the kind of person who meets life as it is, messy, unpredictable, beautiful, and rises again and again. Not because life has gone soft, but because you've hardened your resilience. You grow where most people settle. You build strength where most people seek escape. You learn in the fire of effort who you truly are. But then comes another question. Should you listen to your emotions or interrogate them? How do you feel deeply without becoming ruled by those? Feelings, emotions are slippery. They rush in like waves, sudden, uninvited, unstoppable. A single word, a glance, a memory, and suddenly your body stiffens. Your pulse quickens, your chest tightens, and almost instantly a story begins forming in your mind. Maybe it's anger, maybe shame, maybe joy, grief, or something too complex to name. Emotions don't ask for permission, they just arrive. And in the moment, they feel like absolute truth. But here's the catch. Just because an emotion feels real doesn't mean it's wise. It doesn't mean it deserves to steer your actions. Carl Jung once observed, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming." There is no change from darkness to light or from inertia to movement without emotion. And he was right. Emotion wakes, uses up. It moves us to act, to connect, to protect. But it can also mislead us. It can distort reality. It can pull us into stories that belong more to our past than to the present moment. The goal isn't to ignore emotion. Ignoring leads to repression. And repression never makes emotions disappear. It buries them where they fester and return in darker forms. The goal is more subtle. To feel what you feel, but not be ruled by it. To let emotions inform you without letting them control you. To make room for their message, and then decide consciously how to respond. That's where interrogation comes in, not the harsh, punishing kind, but the curious, compassionate kind. Asking yourself, where is this feeling coming from? Is it really about this moment, or is it an echo from something older? Is it asking me to act or just to notice? Emotions are like children. When ignored, they scream. When acknowledged with care, they soften. Socrates taught that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that includes our emotional lives. Examining emotions isn't about judging them. It's about understanding them. It's about realizing that your sudden anger toward a stranger may be about a boundary you've never set. That your sadness might be grief you never allowed yourself to process. That your jealousy might be pointing toward a neglected part of yourself. But this work requires honesty and patience. Emotions don't arrive neatly labeled. They blur together. Anger hides fear. Calm hides numbness. I'm fine hides exhaustion that sleep alone can't fix. To feel without being ruled requires you to admit what's really underneath. And that takes courage. Most of us were never taught how to do this. We were told to calm down, to toughen up, to just be happy. Emotions were stamped as good or bad, strong or weak. So we learned to hide them, to perform them, to fake them. But beneath the surface, the real feelings never left. They brewed quietly until they spilled out sideways, in sarcasm, in defensiveness, in avoidance, in silence that says too much. Aristotle believed virtue lived in the balance between extremes. Applied to emotions, this means not drowning in them, but not shutting them off either. It means walking the middle path, not impulsively reacting, but not pretending to feel nothing. It means acknowledging the emotion, holding it gently, and then asking, what is the wise response here? What serves truth, the relationship, the moment? And that choice isn't always comfortable. It may lead you into hard conversations, into tears, into vulnerability. But that's where true strength reveals itself, not in pretending you don't feel, but in feeling deeply without losing yourself. The strength to sit with sadness without fleeing, to acknowledge fear without being paralyzed, to feel anger without letting it poison everything around you. That balanced feeling without being ruled is where emotional freedom lives. It's easy to confuse emotional intelligence with emotional control. But real intelligence is not about forcing yourself into silence or suppressing what you feel. It's about naming those feelings, understanding them, and then deciding consciously how to channel their energy. There's a world of difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is automatic. It happens to you. Response is intentional. It flows through you. Plato once described the human soul as a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble, representing reason, and one wild, representing passion. The role of the charioteer, your conscious self, is not to kill the wild horse, but to learn how to steer it. That's what emotional maturity is, not denying passion, but guiding it wisely. Because emotion always carries energy. It can destroy or it can transform. It can wound or it can awaken something deeper in you. The difference lies in whether you are the one driving or the one being dragged, and this is why daily awareness matters so much. It's about noticing your patterns, asking yourself, what emotions tend to surface when I feel threatened? When I feel ignored? When I fail? Do you lash out? Do you shut down? Do you chase validation? Or do you pause, take space, breathe, reflect, and then choose? Emotional maturity isn't born in grand, dramatic meltdowns. It grows in the micro moments, the pause before you reply, the breath before you shout, the walk you take instead of sending the message you'd regret. These are the training grounds where you learn to feel without being ruled. You begin to understand that a feeling is not a command, it's a signal. And like all signals, it requires interpretation, just as physical pain points to something. Beneath the surface, emotional pain does too. It is a message, not a threat. The better you become at interpreting it, the less afraid you are of it. Because now you know, discomfort won't destroy you. You've sat with it before. You've trained for it, and you survived. Carl Jung once said, One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Emotional work is precisely that, making the darkness conscious, allowing the unspoken to be spoken, letting the denied come into the light, not to wallow, but to integrate, to become whole. Because when you refuse to make space for your emotions, they find their own space anyway through your relationships, your body, or your habits. Suppression isn't silence. It's delayed expression, and it usually erupts when you least expect. It got better then, to face it gently and daily, instead of waiting for an explosion. None of this is easy, but it gets easier with practice. You begin to trust yourself. You learn that you can feel sadness without collapsing. You can feel anger without burning bridges. That you can feel love without losing your independence. You learn that you can be deeply human, flawed, emotional, complex, and still remain grounded. Feeling without being ruled means building an inner ground, a place inside that stays steady even as emotions rise and fall. That inner ground doesn't silence emotions, it holds them. It says, I see you. I hear you. Let's figure out what you're telling me. And often, emotions are not demanding immediate action, but pointing toward needs. Rest, boundaries, connection, truth. Emotion is the signal. Wisdom is in the pause. Power is in the response. Socrates once said, know thyself. And knowing yourself begins with knowing what you feel. Not just the feelings you show the world, but the ones that live inside you. Once you see them clearly, you no longer have to be ruled by them. You can feel and still choose. You can ache and still act with love. You can tremble and still walk forward. That is the balance. That is the work. Not to stop feeling, but to start relating to your feelings with clarity, compassion, and courage. Not to judge emotions as good or bad, but to ask, what is this emotion trying to tell me, and how do I want to respond? You will still stumble. You will still react sometimes. You will still say things you regret. That is part of being human. What matters most is returning to awareness, returning to curiosity, returning to the part of yourself that knows how to feel deeply without drowning. Because the goal isn't to escape emotion. The goal is to become someone who can hold it all and remain whole. And this naturally leads to the next question. How do you build a character so solid that it doesn't fracture under pressure? Many people think character is something fixed, something you're either born with or taught early, then carry forever. But character doesn't just appear. It's not polished overnight and pinned to your chest like a medal. It's not a single choice, and it's definitely not a fleeting feeling. Character is built quietly, patiently, repeatedly in the unseen moments. When no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when everything in you wants to take the easy way out. But you don single quotes. T. Jung once said, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. And that's the foundation of character, not ideas, not intentions. Actions. Repeated, consistent actions, especially when it's inconvenient, when it costs you something. That's when your habits speak the loudest. That's when your character is tested. Not when life is smooth, but when it is demanding. The truth is, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your training. Athletes and soldiers repeat this phrase, but it applies just as much to everyday life. The difficult conversations you avoid, the temptations you resist, the choices you make when no one will ever know, those are your training grounds. And the more intentional you are in those private battles, the stronger your character becomes. Character isn't about appearing strong. It's about being dependable when everything falls apart, when plans unravel, when someone betrays you, when you feel like quitting. That is the fracture point, the moment when the world asks, what are you really made of? And what holds you together in that moment isn't a dramatic speech or bold opinion. It's the quiet strength of your character. It's not the grand gestures, but the small, disciplined habits that quietly shape your mind over time. It's the way you've trained yourself to pause before speaking, to listen even when it would be easier to defend, to choose what's right even when there's no immediate reward, to tell the truth even when a lie would be more convenient. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And the same is true of integrity, of courage, of honesty. These are not traits you happen to possess, they are skills you practice. And practice, by its very nature, isn't glamorous. It's repetitive, it's often invisible, it demands patience. But with each repetition, with each quiet choice, you lay a brick. And those bricks over time form the foundation you will stand on when life shakes. Building character means consistency. It means showing up the same way whether anyone notices or not. It means doing the hard thing when there is no applause, when no one's keeping score. It means following through when excuses are loud and comfort is tempting. That's how trust is built, not just trust with others, but trust with yourself. Because real confidence isn't built from compliments or praise. It comes from evidence, and the strongest evidence is this. I've done this before. I've stayed steady before. I know who I am when it's hard. That kind of internal trust is priceless, because when pressure arrives, it doesn't test your words, it tests your habits. It reveals the level of your discipline, the training of your impulses. If your only preparation has been motivation, you will crumble when life demands more. But if you have practiced, if you've been deliberate, then pressure becomes not a wrecking ball, but a mirror. It doesn't destroy you. It reflects back the strength you've already built. Plato wrote about the harmony of the soul, the idea that reason must guide desire and impulse. Character is that harmony lived out through choices that align thought, word, and action. It doesn't mean you never feel fear or frustration. It means you don't allow those feelings to decide who you are. You still feel, you still struggle, but you don't let the struggle rewrite your values. That's what makes character solid, not rigid, not brittle, but responsive, steady, and alive. And this responsiveness is only developed through self-awareness and consistent practice. That's what allows you to hold your ground when everything else feels uncertain. Socrates once said, "The greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be." And the truth is, we all pretend sometimes. We perform, we project. We say things we haven't earned yet, but the difference between pretending and becoming is practice. The question is, are you moving toward alignment or settling for image? That's not a question to avoid. It's essential, because when your image and your actions don't match, something inside fractures. and you feel it. That quiet gap between who you say you are and how you're actually showing up. It's not shame. It's a signal, an invitation to realign. And realignment doesn't come from guilt. It comes from discipline, from shaping your habits deliberately. Because in the end, habits are everything. You won't be saved by your feelings when life gets difficult. You will be carried by what you've practiced, by the small decisions you made when it didn't seem to matter. Because eventually, they matter most. The habit of showing up on time, the habit of keeping your word, the habit of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. These become the threads that hold your integrity together when the storm comes. And storms will come. That's not a matter of if, but when. Someone will betray you. A plan will collapse. You'll feel exhausted or angry or uncertain. That's when you find out whether your character was decoration or foundation. Carl Jung believed wholeness comes from integrating all of yourself, not just the parts you like. Character is forged in that integration, and owning your flaws, your blind spots, your contradictions, and still choosing discipline, choosing kindness even when you're bitter, choosing patience even when you're hurting, choosing values over moods. And no, this isn't about perfection. Nobody gets it right all the time. But every time you choose alignment over ease, you strengthen the structure. You add to your internal framework. And even if you falter, you now have something solid to return to, a rhythm, a standard, a self that doesn't collapse under pressure. And the world feels that difference. You become someone others can trust, not because you say the right words, but because you live them. You become a calming presence, not because you never feel chaos, but because you've trained to stay steady in the middle of it. You become someone who lifts others, not because you perform strength, but because you practiced it. That's how character becomes habit, not through force, but through repetition, through integrity in the small things, through honesty about who you are becoming, through the daily choice to stay present. And the truth is, this work is never finished. You're always building, always refining, always returning to the same question: who am I choosing to be right now? That's the real test. Not who you were yesterday, not who you hope to be in 10 years, but who you choose to be in the next 5 minutes, because that's where character lives, in the tiny, unglamorous, unseen decisions that quietly shape your future self, in the way you speak when you're irritated, in the way you act when you're exhausted, in the choices no one will ever know about except you. So, how do you build a character so solid it doesn't fracture under pressure? You don't build it in grand speeches or big victories. You build it in silence. You build it in routine. You build it in honesty. You build it by living the values you claim again and again until they are no longer just ideals, but the rhythm of your life. That way, when pressure inevitably comes, you won't scramble to find your strength. You'll already be standing on it. And then comes the question: can suffering be reframed as fuel? What if struggle is not something to escape, but something to use? For most of our lives, we treat pain like the enemy. We label it as bad, as proof that something has gone wrong, as a sign we've lost our way. Struggle feels like failure, like misalignment, like a detour. But what if that idea isn't true? What if suffering is not a wrong turn, but part of the path itself? Because whether you want it or not, suffering comes. It is stitched into the fabric of being human. We all lose things. We fail. We fall short. People leave. Plans collapse. Expectations shatter. And in those moments, the instinct is to retreat, to shield ourselves, to numb the ache. But sometimes it's that very ache that shakes us awake. Sometimes the burn clears away the fog, forcing us to see what really matters. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And he meant it. Until something rattles us deeply, we rarely stop long enough to look inward. We coast, skimming the surface, convincing ourselves we're fine. It's only when we are pierced by loss, by disappointment, by heartbreak that we start to ask the harder questions, the kind without quick answers, the kind that lead us deeper into ourselves. That's the strange gift of suffering. It strips away illusion. In pain, you stop pretending. You stop performing. You see who your real friends are. You discover which values actually hold when tested. You find out which parts of you were for show and which parts were built to last. Pain reveals, not gently but honestly, and as brutal as that honesty is, it carries power. Because when you stop running from your suffering and start listening to it, something shifts. Suffering becomes less of a weight to numb and more of a teacher. It stops being passive and starts shaping you actively. If you allow it, struggle doesn't just change circumstances, it reshapes your character. Plato believed that pain and pleasure are deeply connected, often arriving back to back. And he was right. Some of the deepest peace comes after the hardest storms. Some of the strongest bonds are forged in shared pain. Some of the clearest insight only arrives after you sat still with your suffering, long enough to let it speak. But let's be clear, this isn't about glorifying pain for its own sake. Life provides enough suffering without you chasing it. The shift is not in seeking discomfort, but in choosing how to use it when it inevitably comes. It's deciding, even in the middle of hardship, this can shape something good in me. This can fuel growth. This can refine me. Think of the people you admire most, the ones who carry depth, wisdom, and calm. If you trace their lives, you'll usually find that they've walked through fire, illness, betrayal, failure, grief. And they didn't just survive, they transformed. They allowed pain to refine them. Their compassion, their perspective, their groundedness, it was forged in struggle that wasn't ignored, but integrated. Aristotle once wrote that we cannot learn without pain. It's a hard truth, but also a liberating one, because it means your suffering doesn't have to be wasted. It can become fuel. It can give you direction. It can give your life meaning, not immediately, not easily, but eventually. And it begins with not pushing it away. When something hurts, the reflex is to distract, to scroll, to binge, to vent, to numb. Anything to avoid sitting in silence with what's real. But if you can resist that urge, even briefly, if you can turn toward the pain instead of away, you'll begin to hear the message beneath the emotion. You'll begin to ask, what am I grieving? What am I afraid of? What part of me is being asked to grow? Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And suffering, when faced honestly, forces examination. It doesn't punish, it reveals. It forces you to see what you've been avoiding, what you've outgrown, what beliefs no longer fit the life you're meant to live. That confrontation is uncomfortable, sometimes excruciating, but it is sacred because it holds the possibility of transformation. Advice can give you ideas, but pain gives you embodiment. When you feel your way through suffering, when you let it teach you in your breath, in your bones, you don't just understand change, you become it. That's where suffering becomes fuel. It drives you not only to survive, but to evolve, to stop tolerating what drains you, to stop playing small, to start building a life wide enough to hold your full self, not just the polished parts. Sometimes suffering gives urgency. Other times it gives perspective. Either way, it reshapes you not by force, but by friction. And in that friction you become more grounded, more humble, more real. You stop sweating what doesn't matter. You stop needing constant approval. You see through appearances. You grow allergic to the fake, and you begin to hunger for what is true. Real love, real growth, real connection, real effort. Because after suffering, you no longer need life to be perfect. You just need it to be real. You learn to sit with hard moments without sprinting for escape. You learn how to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix them. You realize strength isn't pretending everything is fine, it's crying, and still showing up the next day. Carl Jung also reminded us, I am not what happened to me. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That choice, your decision to use pain rather than shrink from it, is everything. It's what transforms suffering from something that consumes you into fire that refines you. Not fire that burns you down, but fire that burns away what no longer serves you. And once that fire is internalized, it changes you from the inside out. It alters how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you move through the world. You begin to speak with more depth because you've lived through depths. You move with more purpose because you know how fragile life truly is. You stop wasting time on what doesn't align with who you are. When you've suffered, fallen, and risen again, you recognize that every moment is precious. You don't want to squander it. And suffering has another gift, compassion. You become less judgmental because you understand how invisible pain can be. You know what it's like to smile while breaking inside. You know how it feels to show up while carrying heaviness no one else can see. That lived knowledge changes the way you relate to others. You give more grace. You listen with more patience. You connect more deeply. You stop offering cliches and start offering presence. And presence, that grounded awareness that says, I'm here with you, fully, is one of the greatest treasures suffering gives. When life shatters, you see how little truly matters, and how valuable the simplest moments become. A breath, a ray of sunlight, the sound of someone's voice. Suddenly you stop chasing endlessly and start noticing deeply. And that shift, that turn from grasping to noticing, is freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from being ruled by pain. Freedom from being defined by it. You still feel it, but you're no longer afraid of it. You can sit with it. You can learn from it. You can even thank it, not because it was fair, but because it was real. Because it gave you roots. This kind of transformation isn't flashy. It doesn't come with applause. It isn't posted for others to see, but it's deep. It roots you. It grants you clarity that comfort never could, and you earn it through nights you weren't sure you'd survive, through battles no one else witnessed, through choices that tested every fiber of your being. So can suffering be reframed as fuel? Absolutely, if you let it shape you. If you stop running and start listening. If you meet pain with curiosity instead of resistance. It will not be easy, but it will be worth it. Because what suffering builds, resilience, wisdom, clarity, compassion, is unshakable. It is not something anyone can hand you. It is not something anyone can take away. It becomes part of who you are. And then another question arises. What would you change if you remembered daily that time isn't promised? It's a heavy thought, isn't it? And yet, somewhere in the back of our minds, we know it's true. We know life ends. We know time runs out. That there will be a final morning, a final conversation, a final goodbye. But we rarely live as if it's real. We push it aside. We whisper, later. We treat time like a glass that will always refill until one day it doesn't. That's not meant to be morbid. It's meant to be clarifying. Because if you let the reality of time's finiteness settle in, not as a threat, but as a guide, everything shifts. The urgency you feel won't be panic, but presence. The kind of presence that pulls you fully into the moment and asks, is this how I want to spend what I cannot get back? Socrates warned, beware the barrenness of a busy life. We fill our calendars, inboxes, and checklists, believing that productivity equals meaning. But pause and ask yourself honestly, if today were my last 24 hours, would I be proud of how I lived them? For most of us, the answer stings. We live as if time is infinite, when deep down we know it isn't. Every moment lost to distraction, every hour swallowed by resentment, every opportunity buried by fear, that's time you will not reclaim. Carl Jung believed that life is but a short pause between two great mysteries. And if that's true, then this pause matters immensely. Not in the achievement-driven way society sells us, but in the quiet, intentional, soul-level sense. What you do in this short pause is not about impressing. It's about connecting, not about accumulating. It's about becoming. Time isn't just passing, it's shaping you. Every single day you are becoming someone. And if you aren't choosing who that someone is, then the world will choose for you. Your habits, your environment, your fears, if left unchecked, they'll make the decisions for you. And before you realize it, years will pass, and you'll wake up wondering how you drifted so far from yourself. That's the danger of living on autopilot. But what if, instead of pushing thoughts of death and impermanence into the background, you allowed them to sharpen your focus? Not to make you fearful, but to make you truthful. What if you let the reality of time's limits guide your choices with more intention? What would you stop tolerating? What truth would you finally speak? Who would you call without waiting another day? What would you stop holding back, waiting for the world to give you permission? Plato once wrote that time is the moving image of eternity. There's something profound in that idea. Time, in all its fleeting fragility, is the closest thing we have to eternity, because even as it slips through our fingers, it's always there in the present moment, waiting for us to shape it. Every second is a chance to pivot, to return, to begin again. But the problem is we forget. Not because we're careless, but because we're human. We fall into the rhythm of routine, the hum of autopilot days. And in that hum, we miss things. We delay the apology. We postpone the adventure. We bury the truth for later. We act like later is guaranteed. It isn't. And that truth isn't here to scare you. It's here to wake you up. Because when you carry the awareness that time isn't promised, you start noticing differently. You notice the sunlight stretching across your room in the morning, the sound of someone's laugh beside you, the chance to say I love you without needing the perfect moment, the rhythm of your own heartbeat, steady, alive, full of possibility. These small things stop being background noise. They become sacred. Aristotle believed that the aim of life was not pleasure but purpose, and purpose isn't found in big, dramatic breakthroughs. It's built quietly in the small moments, how you show up today, what you choose not to delay, who you choose to love while you still have the chance. One of the hardest truths is this: people are running out of time too. The words left unsaid may never be heard. The grudge you carry may harden into a wall that never comes down. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed for them or for you. So ask yourself, honestly, what exactly are you waiting for? More clarity? More certainty? Someone else's permission? The perfect timing that never seems to come? The truth is, the right moment may never appear, but this moment is real. This day is alive, and it's all you have. Every bold dream, every act of forgiveness, every expression of love must start here, not later, not when it feels easy, no, because the cost of waiting is invisible at first. You don't notice it until months blur into years, and somewhere along the way, the life you meant to live quietly drifts into the background. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But perhaps the brevity of time is the very reason to try, to show up as you are, to stop performing, to stop living by rules written by people who aren't even living them themselves. Because when you finally see time as finite, your question shifts. You stop asking, "What will people think?" and start asking, "What will I regret not doing?" That shift from fear of judgment to fear of regret is where transformation begins. And it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just choosing to spend your morning differently. Turning off your phone and writing, taking a walk and really seeing the world around you, hugging someone longer, speaking more slowly, listening without rehearsing your reply. These small choices are the architecture of a meaningful life. Socrates once said, "Death may be the greatest of all human blessings," not because it's easy, but because it forces us to see life clearly. It sharpens our sense of what matters and what doesn't. You start to care less about status, about accumulation, about proving yourself. You begin to trade image for depth, approval for alignment, the temporary for the timeless. And here's the paradox. When you live as if time is running out, life actually becomes fuller. Not because you're rushing, but because you're truly here. You begin to treat time and people as sacred. You stop wasting it on masks and performances. You give yourself to what feeds your soul, to the people who matter, to the legacy. You leave not in possessions, but in presence. And how you made others feel. So what would you change if you remembered daily that time isn't promised? Maybe you'd forgive faster. Maybe you'd take more risks. Maybe you'd stop playing. Small in a life that's asking you to rise bigger, fuller, freer. You don't need a crisis to wake up. You just need to remember what's already true. Life is fragile. Time is fleeting. And right now you are a live dot. So don't wait. Write the words. Speak the truth. Be kind. Be bold. Be real. The clock is ticking, and that's not something to fear. It's something to use. And then comes another question. What would you pursue if applause meant nothing to you? It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Because so much of what we do, even the things that seem noble, is touched by the desire for recognition, for approval, for applause. We post, we share, we work, we achieve often, not just for the joy of the act itself, but for the nod of validation that comes after. Someone sees, someone praises, and suddenly it feels worthwhile. But what if the applause vanished? What if no one clapped, no one followed, no one admired? Would the work still matter? That's the dividing line between living for outer validation and living from inner purpose. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others celebrate, not who they admire, but who you are without the mask, without the performance, without the audience." Recognition isn't wrong. We all want to be seen. We all want to matter. But the question is, who are you when no one is watching? The problem begins when recognition shifts from being a byproduct to becoming the goal. When applause turns from echo into compass. Slowly, without noticing, you begin shaping your choices not around what fulfills you, but around what earns the loudest reaction. At first, it's subtle. You start a project because it lights you up. But then the views come in or they don't. The feedback arrives or it doesn't. And gradually, you adjust. You start chasing what's popular instead of what's real. You trade your authentic voice for a marketable one. Not because you're dishonest, but because attention feels good and silence feels like failure. But is silence really failure? Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. That includes examining not only what you do, but why you do it. Who are you trying to impress? Who are you working for? And perhaps most importantly, what remains when the spotlight shuts off. Because clarity comes in the quiet, when you stop chasing applause and start listening inward. You begin to ask different questions. Not, will they like this? But, does this matter to me? Not, how can I look successful? But what feels meaningful, even if no one sees it? That shift is uncomfortable because we're conditioned to measure ourselves by reaction. If no one claps, we wonder if we've failed. But sometimes the most important paths are the quiet ones, the ones without a crowd, the ones that demand solitude and faith. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But knowing yourself requires peeling back the layers built for others, the masks, the performances, the roles. Ask yourself, who am I without the likes, the metrics, the reputation? What would I still wake up excited to do if no one ever thanked me for it? What would I build if no one noticed for years, or if no one noticed at all? These questions strip you bare. They reveal not perfection, but honesty. And honesty is where meaning begins, because applause fades. Even the loudest cheers fade into silence. The crowd always moves on. Trends shift. People forget. And if your sense of purpose depends on being praised, then silence will crush you. But if your purpose is rooted in alignment, silence becomes fertile ground. Plato wrote that the greatest wealth is to live content with little. That truth applies not only to possessions, but to attention. Freedom begins when you can be content with your own approval. When you know deep down that your work matters because it's aligned with your values, not because it's trending. That's freedom from trends that drain you. Freedom from bending yourself to meet expectations that were never yours. Freedom to say no to what's popular so you can say yes to what's personal. There is another kind of applause. It doesn't echo from the crowd. It comes from your conscience, from the quiet peace that whispers, "This is true. This is aligned. This is mine." You know you're close to it when you stop needing to explain yourself, when you stop rehearsing justifications for paths others don't understand. You simply live them, proud not because others saw, but because you did. Carl Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's what happens when you release your grip on applause. You're forced to face yourself, not the image, not the curated brand, but the raw, unfinished self underneath. It's unsettling, but it's also liberating. Because real confidence doesn't come from proving you're enough. It comes from realizing you never had to prove it in the first place. That realization doesn't make you passive. It makes you focused. Suddenly your energy isn't scattered across 10 different paths just to stay visible. It's rooted in one path, the one that's real, and the irony, that's when your work begins to resonate. Not because you aimed to be popular, but because you spoke from truth. People feel what's authentic. They are drawn to what's built in silence. Born from depth rather than desperation, the applause may still come, but it's no longer the fuel. It's just background noise. What matters is this. When you lay your head down at night, can you say, "I showed up for what truly matters to me"? That's the applause that counts. And you don't need a stage for it. Just presence, just courage, just the willingness to do the work even when no one is clapping. Do you really need to be seen to be powerful? Or is real power something invisible, immovable, untouchable? In today's world, it's tempting to believe visibility equals value. Social platforms, status symbols, curated performances, everything around us rewards being seen. When people notice you, follow you, talk about you, it feels like proof that you matter, that you're doing something right. But attention isn't power. Attention is currency, and a fragile one at that. It can feel good in the moment, but it's fleeting and often empty. True power doesn't live in the spotlight. It doesn't announce itself or demand applause. It lives in stillness, in quiet knowing, in actions carried out with integrity, even when no one is watching. Plato said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." And the power he spoke of wasn't about leading armies or ruling nations. It was the deeper power of self-mastery, the power to govern yourself, to act from principle, to stay aligned with your values even in silence. That's the foundation of real strength, not domination over others, but command over yourself. We're taught to chase what's visible, to collect trophies, to be talked about. But when your sense of power depends on being seen, it's never secure. Because you're always one opinion away from being ignored, one algorithm update away from being forgotten, one mistake away from losing the spotlight. That's the danger of building worth on visibility. It can vanish overnight. What doesn't vanish is what you've built within. Your discipline, your patience, your clarity. These things cannot be taken because no one gave them to you in the first place. Aristotle believed that the highest good is something that exists for its own sake, not for validation, not for recognition, not for applause. That's what inner power is. It simply is. It doesn't ask to be noticed. And when you encounter someone who embodies it, you feel it. You trust them not because of what they say, but because their presence speaks louder than words ever could. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." External power shines like a light bulb, bright, noticeable, but fragile. Internal power burns like a steady flame, quiet, enduring, unshaken by outside winds. It's not about domination or performance. It's about self-knowledge, about knowing what drives you, what grounds you, what frightens you, and then living in alignment with that truth. That kind of power doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be seen. It simply radiates, and because it's built on truth, it's immovable, not stubborn, but rooted. You've already done the inner work, so when opinions shift, you don't panic. When the room goes silent, you don't collapse. You remain steady because you weren't performing to begin with. But let's be honest, it's tempting to chase what's visible, especially in a world that equates presence with proof. If someone is everywhere, we assume they must be important. If people are listening, we assume they must be right. But attention isn't always earned. Popularity doesn't equal truth. Sometimes the most powerful people are the quiet ones, the ones too busy doing the work to promote it. There's a difference between being impressive and being powerful. Impressive is curated. It's designed to dazzle, to gather applause, but it fades when the moment ends. Power, real power, lingers. It's remembered not because it was flashy, but because it was felt, because it moved something deep, not by force, but by presence. Socrates believed the soul's greatest task was to care for itself, to pursue virtue instead of vanity. And virtue isn't glamorous, it's stable. It's earned in private, in the quiet choices you make when nobody's watching, in the standards you hold when compromise would be easier, in the courage to stay calm when others panic, in the strength to walk away from what isn't right, even if it costs you attention. That's power. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase. It doesn't flinch. It simply stands, rooted, steady, focused. The people who embody this kind of power rarely trend online. They don't speak every time the world demands it. Yet when they do, their presence carries weight, because they aren't swayed by every breeze. They don't rise and fall with applause. They build their lives not around being seen, but around being true. That's the power that doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for validation. It doesn't need a stage to make an impact. It moves through intention, through quiet, action through alignment. It's less concerned with how things look and more with whether they're right. And yet, this kind of invisible power can be lonely. Being unseen while freeing can feel isolating. You may not get recognition. People may misunderstand you. They may wonder why you don't promote yourself more, why you don't play the game, why you don't chase the same numbers they do. And in those moments, you'll have to decide, do I want to be noticed or do I want to be solid? Carl Jung also said, solitude is not the absence of energy or purpose, but the presence of focus. That's what invisible power grants you. Not fame, not noise, but focus. A steady inner ground that no one else can shake. Focus without the burden of performance, without the constant need to manage perception. This is where your energy is freed. Freed to actually do the work. Freed to think deeply, to love with intensity, to act without needing fanfare. That's where true power thrives. And often the most powerful things are the ones hidden from sight. The roots beneath the tree, the foundation beneath the building, the quiet hours of practice that no one witnessed, the resilience someone built alone in silence, the faith it took to keep going long after the crowd stopped watching. These invisible forces are what hold everything else together. You don't need to be seen to be powerful. What you need is consistency. You need to be grounded in your values. You need to know what matters and stand by it even when no one claps. Especially when no one claps, because applause can become addictive, and once you're hooked, you'll start bending. You'll trade truth for relevance. You'll start performing rather than living. And in that trade, your real power begins to fade. But when you can release the craving for recognition, something else emerges: freedom. The freedom to walk your own path without waiting for approval. The freedom to create meaningful work without chasing an audience. The freedom to define your value from the inside out. Plato taught that wisdom begins in wonder, and wonder requires no witnesses. It happens in solitude, in stillness, in the quiet realization that what is real does not need to be seen to be strong. What is true doesn't need a crowd to matter. So ask yourself, what would you still do if no one ever saw you? Do it? What principles would guide you if applause was impossible? What strength would you still build if there was no one to prove it to? The answers to those questions, those deep, private answers, are where your true power lives. Not in the eyes of others, but in the steadiness of your own. And when that kind of inner power shows up in the world, it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to brand itself. It doesn't need to be promoted. It speaks without speaking, moves without forcing, reshapes things without demanding credit. Because it's not a performance, it's simply being. And that, in the end, is the most untouchable form of power there is. But what can we learn about ourselves if we look beyond the spotlight and return to something older, the seasons, the stars, the tides? Are we out of sync with rhythms more ancient than society itself? There's a wisdom woven into the natural world, a rhythm that doesn't rush. The moon takes its time to complete its cycle. Trees let go of their leaves without fear, trusting spring will return. The tide flows out, knowing it will always come back. Nothing in nature forces itself to grow overnight. And yet everything grows. Everything shifts. Everything rests. Everything returns. We, on the other hand, have built a world that resists rhythm. A world obsessed with urgency, with acceleration, with more, always faster, always now. And in that constant chase, something ancient is lost. Not outside of us, but within us. Carl Jung once wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Nature, in its quiet cycles, is full of meaning. And if we pause long enough to notice, it reflects truths we've forgotten. Life isn't linear. Growth isn't always visible. And stillness is not emptiness, but part of the pattern. The seasons don't bloom all year. Neither do we. Yet society tells us we must. That rest is laziness, that slowness is weakness, that productivity equals purpose. So we push when we're tired. We measure our worth by output. We hide our longing for pause, for reflection, for softness. But even the sun disappears for half the day and still returns with light. Plato believed the soul wasn't just logic and reason. It was something eternal, something attuned to harmony. A harmony we can still sense when we stand under a sky of stars, when we walk through a quiet forest, when we watch a wave rise and fall without effort. In those moments, something in us remembers. We are not separate from this rhythm. We are part of it. Yet modern life pulls us away. We stay up under artificial lights. We eat out of sync with the land. We measure time and deadlines, not sunrises. We live in boxes, move in straight lines, follow calendars that don't care whether the soul is ready. And then we wonder why we feel disconnected. But there is an intelligence in nature that doesn't argue. The bear doesn't debate when to hibernate. The tide doesn't resist the pull of the moon. The tree doesn't question whether shedding its leaves is weakness. They simply trust the cycle. They surrender not passively, but wisely, knowing that everything has its time. Aristotle spoke of eudaimonia, human flourishing. But flourishing isn't frantic. It isn't found in burnout. It isn't constant sprinting. It's found in alignment with yourself, with your values, with the greater world. And alignment only comes when you reconnect with rhythm, when you stop sprinting and start flowing. We are not meant to sprint endlessly through life. We are meant to rise and rest, to gather and release, to ebb and flow. But the world rarely grants us that permission, which means we must learn to grant it to ourselves. To listen not just to the noise, but to the stillness. To feel the quiet pull of our own inner tides. Those tides don't shout. They show up as fatigue you try to push through, as intuition you override, as longing you distract yourself from. But they return again and again, like the moon pulling the sea, asking you to slow down, to return to something older, simpler, truer. Socrates said that wisdom begins in knowing how little we know. Perhaps part of that wisdom is admitting how little we understand about our own nature. How often do we fight against our own seasons, trying to bloom in winter, trying to sprint when our soul is asking us to root? Nature never resists itself, and maybe neither should we. To live in rhythm doesn't mean abandoning ambition. It means honoring your natural pace. It means understanding that progress has plateaus, that growth always includes cycles of decay, and that clarity often arrives, not in the noise of effort, but in the stillness of waiting. A seed does its most important work in darkness before it ever touches the sun. The moon waxes and wanes without apology, and still, even in its phases of shadow, it guides the ocean and lights the night. Power doesn't always look like constant motion or endless productivity. Sometimes power looks like presence, like showing up honestly for the season you're in without pretending to be full when you're empty. Nature becomes a mirror when we pay attention. The stars remind us of scale, how vast, how ancient, how connected everything is. The tides remind us that withdrawal is not the end, but part of return. The tree teaches us that letting go is not weakness, but survival. None of these lessons are abstract. They're invitations to remember something older than society, something we carried before we forgot. Carl Jung believed that symbols and archetypes, sun, moon, light, dark, earth, fire, live inside the psyche. To understand ourselves, we must also understand the patterns that shape the world. When we look at the seasons, we're not just observing nature. We're hearing echoes of our own unconscious mind. The rhythms outside are speaking to rhythms within, but to hear them, we must slow down. We must stop filling every silence with noise, every moment with tasks. We must learn the difference between motion and meaning, between exhaustion and purpose, between a full schedule and a full life. Ancient societies understood this. They marked time by solstices, by harvests, by migrations. They lived by rhythms, not by deadlines. They knew there was a time to reap and a time to rest, a time to speak and a time to be silent, a time to rise and a time to return. We've tried to outgrow those truths, but they still live in our bodies. No matter how fast we move, the soul remembers. And when we ignore those rhythms, something breaks inside. That's why so much of modern anxiety, burnout, and restlessness isn't about doing too little. It's about being out of sync. You can't replace alignment with effort. So maybe the way forward isn't to do more, but to remember more, to return to the wisdom of the seasons, to allow yourself to live in cycles instead of schedules, to know when to push and when to pause, to feel what season of life you're in and to honor it, whether it's a season of becoming, of breaking, of speaking, or of silence. None of them are wasted. Even winter, cold and bare, is necessary. It's where roots deepen, where the next chapter quietly begins. Aristotle once said, "Nature does nothing uselessly. Neither do you. Even in your stillness, even in your waiting, even in those long, slow days when nothing seems to be happening, life is moving. Something is shifting. Work is being done beneath the surface. But you must choose to see it, to trust it. The world may not applaud you for slowing down, but nature doesn't need applause to bloom. And neither do you. So what can we learn by watching the stars, the tides, the seasons? We learn that waiting is not wasted. That silence is not empty, it's full of transformation. That rest is not the opposite of progress, but a condition for it. We learn that we are not separate from nature. We are stitched from the same rhythms, and maybe the deepest wisdom isn't in mastering life, but in matching its pace. Not in forcing our way forward, but in remembering that the direction was always written in the wind, the water, the wild within us. Which leads to another question. Do you really know your thoughts, or are you simply living inside them? What could happen if you made them visible, gave them shape, put them on paper? Most of us never truly examine what moves through our minds. Thoughts arrive, and we accept them. We follow them. We argue with them. We believe them. They quietly build our moods, our worldview, our reality. And because we're so accustomed to the noise in our heads, we forget it's even there, like background music that we no longer notice but still move to. But what if you paused? What if you stepped outside of the current for a moment? What if instead of swimming endlessly in thought, you stood on the shore and observed? One of the simplest and most powerful ways to do this is through writing. Not for performance, not for an audience, but simply to see. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Most of us are doing exactly that, living out fears, beliefs, and stories we've never examined. Writing, whether through journaling or any raw form of expression, pulls those hidden patterns into the light. It gives shape to the vague and swirling. It takes the endless loop in your head and places it on the page, where it can finally be seen. When you write, you begin an honest examination. You become both thinker and observer, participant and witness. Suddenly you start to see the gaps in your own logic, the contradictions you've been living with, the wounds you've quietly avoided. But writing isn't only for moments of clarity. It's just as vital, perhaps even more vital, for the moments of confusion. Because putting pen to paper when your thoughts are tangled has a strange way of pulling the threads together. You may begin in fog, uncertain, lost, but line by line, you carve a path through the haze, not by solving everything, but by naming it, by saying, "This is what I'm carrying. This is what I've been afraid to admit. This is what I've left unsaid." Aristotle said, "The soul never thinks without a picture." Writing creates that picture. It translates the invisible into something you can see and touch. On the page, you don't just see how you look, you see how you think, how you fear, how you hope. And what you find often surprises you. You notice beliefs you've outgrown but never challenged. You uncover emotions you never gave proper space to. You recognize patterns that have repeated in your life, quietly steering you, without you ever asking why. That's the power of writing without filter. No audience, no performance, no curation, just raw honesty. You write not to impress, but to understand. And in that process, you often become more truthful with yourself than you've been in years. And here's the strange thing, when thoughts finally spill onto the page, they often lose their grip. A fear that felt enormous in your chest looks small when reduced to words. A judgment you thought was truth suddenly reveals itself as insecurity. A dream you've neglected starts to breathe, again simply because you've given it space. Plato believed that knowledge is remembering, recovering truth the soul already knows. Writing is a form of remembering. You're not always uncovering something brand new. You're rediscovering something essential that was buried under busyness, shame, or distraction. The page becomes a place where you meet yourself again, where the real you comes out from hiding. And yet many people resist writing. They say they're not good at it, that it feels silly or pointless, that they wouldn't know what to say. But that very discomfort is the threshold. That's where the work begins. You don't write because you have answers. You write because you have questions. You write to hear your mind when it isn't being interrupted. You write to see what happens when you stop editing your feelings in real time. The page doesn't judge you. It doesn't roll its eyes, interrupt, or demand that you make sense. That's what makes it sacred. It's one of the only places you can be completely honest without consequence. You can admit rage, grief, longing, confusion, all the things you might be too afraid to voice out loud. And in that space, healing begins. Carl Jung once said, "Solitude is for me a fountain of healing, which makes my life worth living." Writing creates that solitude, not isolation, but space. A clearing in the noise. A pause where you can sit not with answers, but with yourself. And in that space, something starts to shift. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, more aware. You stop taking every thought at face value. You begin asking, where did this come from? What does it want? Does it serve me or harm me? This kind of awareness doesn't appear by accident. It grows through practice, by showing up to the page, even when you don't feel like it, even when the words are clumsy, even when you're convinced nothing's happening, because something is happening. You're training your mind to slow down, to process, to integrate. And integration is different from insight. Insight is that lightning bolt moment of clarity. Integration is quieter. It's what happens when you take that insight and begin living it. It's the way writing shapes not just what you know, but how you act, how you speak to yourself when you fail, how you show up in relationships, how you make choices when you're under pressure. Socrates said, "Wisdom begins in wonder." Writing is an act of wonder. It doesn't demand answers, it sits with the questions. It lets the questions do their work, moving you in ways you can't predict. You don't have to write every day, but you do have to write honestly. Not to sound profound, but to sound like yourself, the real, imperfect, searching you. The version of you who's tired of carrying unspoken thoughts and ready to finally lay them down, even just for a page, because a page is a mirror. And when you stare into it long enough, you start to see past the surface. You begin to hear the voice of the self that's been waiting for you. Writing won't solve everything, but it will reveal everything. And from revelation, change finally becomes possible. Slowly, almost without realizing it, line by line, day by day, you begin to move through life differently. You catch yourself being more patient in moments that once irritated you. You find yourself grounded where you used to be scattered. The chaos in your mind feels less overwhelming because you've finally seen it, named it, and faced it. Writing gave you a mirror, and once you've looked into it, you can't unsee what's there. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But knowing yourself isn't a one-time breakthrough. It isn't a single epiphany that solves everything. It's a conversation ongoing, evolving, sometimes uncomfortable, always necessary. Writing is how you stay in that conversation. It's how you remain honest, how you stay close to what matters most. So ask yourself, do you truly know your thoughts? Or are you just living inside them without question? You can find out. It doesn't require a degree, a teacher, or an audience. It just takes a blank page and the courage to begin. And that leads us to a bigger question. What's more powerful, convincing someone or becoming someone worth emulating? From a young age, most of us are taught to persuade. We learn to argue, to defend, to explain ourselves. We're told that if we can say something clearly enough, passionately enough, people will listen. And yes, words have power. A strong argument can open a door. A well-timed phrase can plant a seed. But words alone rarely create deep, lasting transformation. Because people don't just listen with their ears, they watch. They feel. They notice when your life doesn't match your message. That's where something deeper begins. It's one thing to say something meaningful. It's another to live it. When your actions quietly align with your values, When your choices reflect what you claim to believe, people sense it. That kind of presence, quiet, steady, embodied, is far more persuasive than any argument. It doesn't push or pressure. It draws. It doesn't force agreement. It offers a model. Plato wrote that the soul naturally seeks what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. But it needs to see those things in real life, not just in theories or speeches, but in living examples. Quiet leadership doesn't need to announce itself. When you meet someone who listens fully without rushing to reply, who keeps their word even when it costs them something, who responds to conflict without cruelty, that presence plants a quiet question in you. Could I live like that? What would my life feel like if I moved with that kind of strength? Aristotle believed that virtue was not a single act, but a habit, a way of being formed through repetition. He called it ethos character, and he taught that ethos is the most persuasive element of any argument, not just because it earns credibility, but because it shows what's possible. People don't want lectures, they want proof. Proof that peace is possible, that honesty can coexist with kindness, that confidence doesn't need to be loud, that love can remain steady. Carl Jung said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And it's true. Preaching values is easy. Living them, especially when no one is watching, is hard. That's where influence is forged. In the quiet consistency, in the moments when it's easier to compromise, but you don't. In the times when you admit your mistakes instead of covering them up. We've all met people whose words were eloquent but whose lives betrayed them. Even if we couldn't explain it, we felt the gap, and that gap broke trust. That's why real influence doesn't come from persuasion alone. It comes from alignment. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't need to raise its voice. You can feel it in someone who has done the inner work, who has faced their own contradictions, who doesn't need to control others because they've learned how to guide themselves. Those are the people we remember, not because they convinced you but because they became examples worth following. And it's not about perfection. It's about humility. It's about someone who says, "Here's what I believe, and I'm trying to live it as best as I can." Someone who admits their flaws, who keeps learning, who refuses to posture. Influence doesn't come from being flawless. It comes from being real, steady, and consistent. Socrates said, "Let him that would move the world first move himself." That's the essence of it. You can spend your energy debating, defending, trying to convince everyone. Or you can spend that same energy becoming someone whose life speaks louder than arguments ever could. That doesn't mean you stop using words. It means your words carry weight because they're backed by the way you live. And when you live that way, something shifts. You stop needing to win arguments. You stop needing to always be right, because you've moved from persuasion to embodiment, from saying the truth to being the truth. That's influence that can't be faked. People are always watching more than they're listening. They notice how you treat the person who has nothing to offer you. They notice how you carry yourself when you fail. They notice whether you stay kind when it's inconvenient. Those are your real messages, and they echo louder than speeches. Aristotle said, "Character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion." And he was right, because character isn't what you claim, it's what you consistently practice. And when it's strong, people trust it, even if they don't yet agree with everything you say. We live in a culture obsessed with visibility, platforms, and noise. But true influence isn't measured in volume. It's measured in alignment. And alignment always speaks for itself. It comes from living in such a way that even in silence, others can sense it. They notice your steadiness, your calm, your integrity, and your kindness, and it makes them wonder what kind of inner work built that presence. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." The journey of becoming someone worth emulating doesn't begin with an audience. It begins inside. It's slower, less glamorous, often unseen, but it lasts because it's not reactionary, it's reflective. It's not built on applause, but on alignment with truth. And here's the gift. When you shift from convincing others to becoming yourself, you find freedom. You don't need everyone to agree. You don't need your peace tied to someone else's approval. You learn to let people move at their own pace because you trust that your life, lived authentically, says what it needs to say, even if no one notices right away. That kind of influence changes families, shapes communities, and slowly shifts culture. Not through noise, but through example, through quiet, steady presence, through the daily decision to live what you claim. It isn't always easy, but it is always worth it, because at the end of the day, your most powerful message isn't a speech or a quote, it's who you are. And when your actions match your values, you won't need to argue. You'll simply become the reason others begin to ask better questions, and maybe even start living better answers. But this raises a deeper challenge. What if the ultimate goal isn't peace or success or even virtue? What if it's to become someone that life itself cannot break? That question flips everything we've been taught. Most of us chase peace, comfort, approval, success, because we think those are the end goals, that once we have them, we'll be untouchable, secure, safe. But life never promised that. In fact, it often promises the opposite. It tests us. It strips away the surface comforts and exposes who we truly are beneath them. Carl Jung put it bluntly, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Life will happen. It will throw storms at you without warning. It will break timelines and tear apart carefully laid plans. And in those moments, the real question isn't, did I achieve success? Or am I comfortable now? The real question is, can I still stand? To be someone life cannot break doesn't mean becoming numb, cold, or detached. It doesn't mean shutting down your heart. It means walking through fire without losing yourself. It means staying human, staying true, staying whole, even when loss cuts deep. That strength isn't flashy. It's often quiet, forged in solitude. In the mornings when you want to quit but don't. In the hard conversations where honesty feels impossible, but you choose it anyway. In the moments when everything in you screams to give up, and yet you keep moving forward. Plato believed that the soul grows stronger through struggle, and he was right, because in struggle, the masks fall away. You can't fake who you are when the world is burning. You either bend or you become. Maybe the real pursuit of life isn't chasing comfort, but building the kind of core that can't be shaken. A character that doesn't fracture under pressure. A spirit that doesn't collapse under loss. And that core isn't gifted, it's built. It's built through pain, through discipline, through the repetition of showing up for yourself, even when it's hard, even when it's costly, even when no one is watching. Aristotle taught that virtue is the balance between extremes. Courage, for example, isn't recklessness, and it isn't cowardice. It's standing firm in the middle. That's what being unbreakable is. Not never feeling fear, but choosing to act with integrity even while afraid. Because when the world shakes, the only thing that remains is who you've chosen to become. Socrates said, "No evil can happen to a good man either in life or after death." What he meant wasn't that harm won't touch you. It will, but true harm only happens when you betray yourself, when you abandon what you know is right for what is easy, safe, or applauded. And life will tempt you to do exactly that. It will whisper, "Just compromise, just stay quiet, just give in." And it may even reward you for it temporarily. But deep down you'll know. That's why becoming unbreakable matters. Because when your identity is rooted in your values, in your truth, in your hard-earned discipline, then nothing external can undo you. Life can strip away possessions, titles, relationships, and even opportunities, but it cannot strip away the self you've built through honesty, courage, and resilience, and that building is slow. It's often invisible. It's hidden in the choices no one sees but you, the choice to keep your word, to speak honestly, to act with kindness, to hold the line when compromise would be easier. Over time, those choices add up. They become layers of strength. Until one day something happens that would have destroyed the old you, and instead you remain standing. That's when you know you've become someone who bends but doesn't break. Someone who feels but doesn't drown. Someone who loses but doesn't lose themselves. Jung believed that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of life. And wholeness means accepting all of yourself, the strong and the fragile, the light and the shadow, the joy and the grief. When you accept all of it, you become steady. Not because life is easy, but because you are. And in that steadiness, storms stop defining you. They reveal you. They show that you are someone who has walked through fire and come out not immune, but deeper, truer, unshakable. That is the real victory. Not in what you've achieved, but in what you've endured without losing yourself. So maybe the real question isn't, how do I get what I want? But how do I become the kind of person who remains whole no matter what happens? Because when you become that person, you don't just survive the chaos, you guide others through it. You walk through the ashes without losing your light. And that, more than success, more than peace, more than even virtue, is the ultimate strength. That's the invitation. To become someone life cannot break. If this resonated with you, drop a comment. What's one struggle that has shaped you the most? And when you're ready to go deeper, check out the full StoicCraft playlist. We've built it as a guide to help you grow into someone life cannot break.